The Kansas you think you know. Flat fields, quiet highways, endless sky is a lie. Beneath the soil and hidden in the stone are scars, symbols and ruins that refuse to explain themselves. A lost city larger than Manhattan, riverside carvings no one can read, springs that never run dry, and cosmic firestones buried in farm fields. Tonight, we're not flying over Kansas, we're falling into it. 2 hours of pre-flood mysteries, each one deeper than the last, each one daring science to make sense of what it cannot. Welcome to the secrets under the prairie. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next descent into the unknown. And while you're here in this strange corner of Kansas with me, tell me, where in the world are you listening from and what time is it on your clock right now? 1. How big was Etsanoa? Really? Imagine flying a drone over the fields near Arkansas City, Kansas, and realizing the neat rows of crops don't just make patterns, they trace the ghost of a vanished city. A city that, if some archaeologists are right, was bigger than anything else on the plains in its day. They call it Etsanoa, the so-called Great Settlement of the ancestral Wichita people. And like all good mysteries, its size is both obvious and unknowable at the same time. The ground whispers one thing. The Spanish chroniclers muttered another. The truth sits somewhere in between, laughing at both. The story starts in 1601, when Juan de Oñate and his company wandered into this territory. His scribes described a settlement that stretched for miles. Houses of grass, families upon families, fields rich enough to feed a nation. Later readers, from the safety of armchairs and hindsight, shrugged and assumed Oñate exaggerated it. After all, conquistadors were never shy about overselling. But then, modern technology turned on. Magnetometers, drones, and multispectral cameras began scanning the Kansas earth. And beneath the soil, hints of post holes, hearths, storage pits, layer upon layer of domestic life sprawled across thousands of acres. Suddenly, Oñate's bragging didn't sound so impossible. But here's the problem. Where does the city begin and where does it end? Etsanoa wasn't Manhattan with a grid or Rome with a wall. It was a ribbon settlement stretching along the Arkansas River Valley like pearls on a thread. Some say it held 20,000 people. Others say 10,000, maybe fewer. The estimates shift like the Kansas wind. Counting houses in buried soil stains is not as simple as tallying skyscrapers. Every new survey seems to push the number higher, then lower again, like a yo-yo designed by history itself. And yet, the emotional weight of the numbers is almost more interesting than the numbers themselves. Because if Etsanoa really held tens of thousands of people, then the narrative of Kansas as empty prairie waiting for homesteaders collapses into absurdity. It wasn't empty. It was populous, organized, alive. A place of trade, ceremony, and politics long before Europeans scribbled names onto maps. The size of Etsanoa is not just an archaeological puzzle. It's an ideological one. How big we say it was reveals how much we're willing to admit about the history of the plains. Of course, scientists have tried to measure the sprawl with precision. Core samples, radar scans, GIS mapping. Every data set reveals a city that keeps playing hide and seek. Crop growth bends differently over buried ditches. Soil chemistry changes where food once rotted in storage pits. But no single tool delivers the definitive footprint. The city refuses to give us its senses. Maybe that's fitting. A place once teeming with life now survives as an argument, a collection of maybes strung together across centuries. And yet, the question keeps gnawing. How big was it really? Big enough to terrify Spanish soldiers who describe warriors swarming like ants. Big enough that when archaeologists walk the fields today, every few steps they crunch down on flint flakes, pottery shards, bones, all reminders that this was once crowded ground. But was it 20,000? Was it 40,000? Or are we chasing shadows inflated by both conquistador bravado and our own desire for lost grandeur? Which leads to an even stranger puzzle. Because within this great city, researchers have found a massive circular earthwork, a feature no one can quite pin down. Was it an arena, a calendar, a fortification, or something else entirely? If Etsanoa's size unsettles us, its mysterious circle confounds us even more. 2. What was the council circle at Etsanoa used for? Astronomy, ceremony, defense, or something else? Some mysteries like to whisper. Others prefer to shout from the ground. At Etsanoa, the shout takes the form of a massive circular earthwork etched into the Kansas soil centuries ago and still visible today through the eyes of remote sensing technology. Archaeologists call it the council circle, which sounds neat and authoritative. Except no one knows whether it was a council circle, a sacred observatory, a defensive fortification, or a prank pulled on future historians. The name gives the illusion of certainty. The reality is a void wrapped in a perfect ring. From above, the structure looks deliberate, an immense circle, almost geometric in its proportions. The soul tells us it was intentionally dug, not the product of erosion or a casual ditch left by livestock. But beyond that, interpretation dissolves into a free-for-all. Was it a calendar where ancestral Wichita priests tracked the march of the stars? Perhaps the circle marked solstices and equinoxes, aligning with the sun's path across the horizon. Cultures around the world carved stone or earth into cosmic clocks, so why not here, on the banks of the Arkansas River? Or was it ceremonial, the plains version of a great plaza where feasts, dances, and rites unfolded? Imagine thousands gathering in a space with no walls, no ceiling, only the Kansas sky. A living theater in the round, where politics and spirituality blurred, where alliances were sealed, where stories were performed for memory itself. The scale hints at communal importance, too large for a mere backyard project, too precise to be casual. And then there's the military theory. Some scholars, with a raised eyebrow, have suggested it might have been defensive, fortification or rallying ground. Perhaps the circle's geometry helped focus movement, control crowds, or mark territory in a way that was as much about intimidation as utility. The Wichita, after all, lived in a world of shifting alliances and occasional raids. A giant circle carved into the earth could just as easily have been a billboard. This land is organized, defended, claimed, but the problem is this. None of these interpretations rest on ironclad evidence. The soil keeps its secrets, stubborn as stone. Unlike Stonehenge or Chaco Canyon, Etzanoa's circle doesn't come with monumental rocks to anchor the narrative. It's a subtle imprint, barely there, a phantom more than a ruin, which means every interpretation is as much projection as conclusion. Archaeologists admit as much, often with a weary shrug. Still, the uncertainty might be the point. To stand at the side, or rather above it, since the circle is clearest from the sky, is to feel the tug of human intention without the gift of human explanation. Someone, centuries ago, rallied enough labor to carve this ring into the land. They cared enough to make it perfect, visible, enduring. And now we're left to care about it without understanding why. If Etzanoa's sheer size challenges our assumptions about what cities on the plains look like, the Council's circle challenges our assumptions about what those cities believed in. Was the circle pragmatic, cosmic, or purely symbolic? The not knowing is the most powerful answer of all. Because right when you think you've grasped Etzanoa, it slips into myth again. And speaking of slipping, there's another question scholars can't agree on. Is Etzanoa the same place Coronado called Quivira? Or was it something entirely different? The names overlap, the locations blur, and the truth, as usual, prefers to hide. Etzanoa's council circle leaves us with questions that refuse to close. And trust me, the deeper we go, the stranger it gets. If you're hooked already, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this journey. And while the circle is still spinning in your mind, drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from? And what time is it where you're listening? 3. Is Etzanoa part of or distinct from Coronado's Quivira? The Spanish loved to name things, usually before they had any clue what those things actually were. Case in point, Quivira, the fabled land Francisco Vázquez de Coronado stumbled toward in 1541, lured by rumors of gold cities and kingdoms shimmering in the northern grasslands. What he actually found, according to his own disgruntled notes, was not gold, but straw houses, cultivated fields, and people who seemed entirely unimpressed by a caravan of armored men dragging cannons across the prairie. Centuries later, the debate still lingers, like smoke over a campfire. Was Quivira the same settlement complex later known as Etzanoa, or was it something else entirely? On the surface, it seems obvious. Both accounts describe thriving grass house communities along rivers in south-central Kansas. Both mention extensive agriculture, bustling villages, and organized societies. The scale matches up too. Coronado claimed Quivira was large enough to dazzle even a skeptical conquistador, and modern archaeologists suspect Etzanoa stretched for miles. The temptation is irresistible. Fuse the two names together and declare victory. But history refuses easy mergers. Coronado's Quivira was positioned further north and east by some accounts, while Etzanoa is pinned near Arkansas City. Distances in conquistador journals were notoriously slippery, measured in days of travel rather than miles, skewed by memory, ambition, or the need to impress patrons back in Spain. A day's journey could be 20 miles or 50, depending on how many horses went lame or how many arguments broke out among the men. Scholars poring over these vague logs disagree violently over how to plot the expedition's path. One cartographer's Quivira is another's blank spot on the map. Even the languages don't line up neatly. Coronado described encountering the people of Quivira, often linked with ancestors of the Wichita, but he never called them Etzanoa. That name surfaces later in records tied to Oñate's 1601 expedition. Was this simply a difference in transcription? Two Spanish scribes recording two different words for the same place? Or were they genuinely different polities, neighboring but distinct like Manhattan and Brooklyn, separated by more than just a river? The documents don't clarify. They confuse. And confusion, like erosion, only deepens with time. There's also the nagging suspicion that Coronado, in his disappointment, deliberately downplayed what he saw. He expected gold and stone palaces. What he got was cornfields and grass houses. To a European audience, calling this a great city might have seemed ridiculous. So his descriptions wobble between grudging admiration and snarky dismissal. If Quivira really was at Sanoa, then the conquistador's blind spot robbed posterity of an accurate account. If it wasn't at Sanoa, then we are chasing mirages across centuries of mislabeling. The debate carries more than academic weight. If Quivira and Etzanoa were the same, it suggests a continuity of settlement and identity stretching across decades, strong enough to persist through contact and upheaval. If they were different, it points to a more complex patchwork of ancestral Wichita centers, a mosaic of communities rather than a monolithic great settlement. Either way, the question refuses to sit still, and that's the essence of the mystery. Quivira and Etzanoa might be mirror images of each other, two names for one place, or two overlapping shadows mistaken for one. The uncertainty forces us to look harder, to admit how thin our reconstructions of the past really are. Of course, the puzzle doesn't end there. Even if we could decide whether Etzanoa was Quivira or not, another thorny problem emerges. How did Coronado and later Oñate actually get there? Their journals survive, but the precise trails they cut across Kansas soil remain maddeningly contested. The maps have lines. The land itself has silence, and between them a mystery waits. 4. Which exact routes did Coronado, 1541, and Oñate, 1601, take across Kansas to reach these places? If you've ever tried to follow directions from someone who says, just go down the road a bit until you see the big tree, then turn left, you know how unhelpful vague instructions can be. Now imagine trying to reconstruct a 16th or 17th century road trip across Kansas, using nothing but conquistador journals scribbled in Spanish, translated and mistranslated, filtered through ambition, and measured not in miles but in days of travel. That's the historian's nightmare when it comes to Coronado's 1541 trek to Quivira and Juan de Oñate's 1601 journey to Etzanoa. We know they made it. We even know roughly when. But where exactly did they walk, ride, and drag their baggage? That's where the trail goes hazy. The problem starts with the sheer scale of the plains. Coronado left New Mexico chasing rumors of golden cities to the north. He and his men slogged through what is now the Texas Panhandle, crossing into Kansas in search of Quivira. The chroniclers recorded features, rivers, rolling grasslands, the occasional grove of trees. But here's the catch. Kansas has a lot of rivers, grasslands, and groves. Try matching Broad River with trees on either side to a modern map, and you can point to a dozen candidates. The Arkansas, the Walnut, the Little Arkansas. Scholars argue passionately over each bend and ford, like detectives debating blurry footage in a cold case. Oñate's later expedition only complicates things further. In 1601, he marched northeast from New Mexico with a sizable force, eventually clashing with the people of Etzanoa. His scribes also left descriptions of the route, again filled with vague landmarks and counts of days' march. The accounts mention buffalo hunts, rivers crossed, and encounters with plains groups. Yet none of the descriptions provide the kind of cartographic precision we crave today. One day's journey might have been 20 miles if spirits were high, 10 miles if the horses were limping, or 30 if Oñate's ambition got the better of his men. Archaeologists have tried to overlay these old texts on modern geography. Some propose Coronado entered Kansas near Liberal, drifted northeast, and eventually hit the Arkansas River Valley near Wichita before striking north toward Lyons. Others insist he cut a more easterly route, hugging different river valleys. Oñate's path faces the same scholarly tug of war. Did he follow Coronado's shadow or carve his own through the prairie? The lack of artifacts directly tied to the expeditions leaves the ground stubbornly silent. And here's where the human element creeps in. Conquistadors were notorious for exaggerating or omitting details to please their patrons. Coronado needed to justify his grueling march, even though he returned empty-handed. Oñate needed to project authority and competence, despite his expedition ending in disputes. The journals are as much political documents as travel logs. Every bend of the river might have been bent again in the retelling. So what are we left with? A puzzle of guesses, competing maps, and reconstructions that change with each generation of scholarship. One historian insists Coronado camped here. Another swears he was 50 miles west. The land gives no confirmation, only endless horizons where armies once passed and vanished. And yet, that uncertainty is almost poetic. To not know exactly where they marched is to admit that the land itself still holds secrets, that Kansas refuses to be neatly plotted. The routes are ghost roads, traveled once, remembered poorly, and forever out of reach. But even if the trails blur, one thing is clear. Coronado and Oñate weren't marching through emptiness. They were moving through a cultural landscape already thick with people, which raises the next question that refuses to stay quiet. Where did the Great Bend aspect, the ancestors of the Wichita, come from? And how did their society take shape in this very place? 5. Where did the Great Bend aspect, ancestral Wichita, come from? And how did it coalesce? Every archaeological label carries a hint of arrogance. Great Bend aspect is one such label, an umbrella term invented by 20th century archaeologists to categorize a cluster of prehistoric sites along the Great Bend of the Arkansas River in central Kansas. Pottery styles, house patterns, stone tools, storage pits, burial customs, they all fit together into a recognizable pattern. Neat, convenient, boxed up for textbooks. Except, of course, human lives aren't neat or boxed. The real question is, how did this culture, the ancestral Wichita, come to exist in the first place? That's where the trouble begins. Archaeologists know that by around AD 1400, the Great Bend Aspect villages dotted the river valleys, complete with grass houses, fields of maize, beans, and squash, and complex social networks stretching across the plains. But tracing their origins is like trying to follow smoke back to the fire. Some researchers see clear roots in the Central Plains tradition, which flourished earlier in Nebraska and Kansas between AD 900 and 1400. According to this theory, the Great Bend Aspect was a direct descendant. Central Plains farming communities that migrated, reorganized, and adapted to new environments. The pottery looks similar enough to suggest family resemblance, if not continuity. Others aren't so sure. They see signs of influences sweeping in from the south, the Caddoan-speaking peoples of Oklahoma and Texas. Certain ceramic styles hint at exchanges or migrations. Trade goods such as marine shell beads suggest connections running downriver toward the Gulf Coast. Could the Great Bend Aspect have been a fusion zone, where northern plains farmers met southern Caddoan traders, and in the meeting created something new? It's an attractive idea, a cultural crossroad carved into the Kansas prairie. And then there's the possibility of multiple origins working together, a messy, entangled process rather than a single aha moment of creation. Human societies rarely spring up overnight. They accumulate like layers of sediment. A pinch of Central Plains tradition here, a dash of Caddoan influence there, local innovation sprinkled on top. The Great Bend Aspect might simply be the name we've given to a slow-burn transformation, one that looked inevitable in hindsight but felt chaotic at the time. The archaeological record doesn't resolve the debate. Pottery fragments can tell us something about technique and style, but not about how people saw themselves. A vessel stamped with a certain motif might hint at ancestry, or it might just reveal that someone liked the design of their neighbors downriver. Storage pits filled with charred corn tell us agriculture was central, but not how farming knowledge spread, or whether it came by migration, imitation, or both. The soil, as usual, is informative and silent all at once. What makes the origins question more haunting is its aftermath. However, the Great Bend Aspect coalesced. By the time Europeans wandered into Kansas in the 1500s and 1600s, the people we call the Wichita had already built networks of towns and fields that astonished outsiders. Their society was robust, but not immune. Within a few generations, upheaval rolled through. Disease, conflict, shifting trade patterns, and climate stresses. The mystery of their rise is mirrored by the mystery of their sudden dispersal. And that leads to the next haunting puzzle. If the Great Bend Aspect and its successors had managed to establish large, thriving communities along the rivers, why did so many of those towns vanish in the 1600s and 1700s? What forces unraveled the settlements, scattering the people and erasing their once sprawling centers from the landscape? The answer, as always, refuses to be simple. 6. Why did Great Bend Kivira communities relocate in the 1600s, 1800s? Conflict, disease, climate, trade shifts. The rise of a civilization is never simple, neither is its unraveling. By the 1600s, the Great Bend aspect villages, the heart of Quivira, Etsanoa, and the ancestral Wichita world had begun to change. Archaeological traces show abandonment here, relocation there, entire villages shifting like chess pieces across the Kansas landscape. What happened? Why did these large organized agricultural towns start to break apart and scatter, leaving behind only pottery shards, house rings, and rumors in Spanish chronicles? The easy answer is everything happened at once. Plains life in the 17th century was not calm. It was a storm. Spanish expeditions wandered north from New Mexico. French traders pushed west from the Mississippi, and indigenous groups across the region found themselves caught in new webs of trade, warfare, and disease. The Great Bend's Kivira communities were no exception. They were connected, they were visible, and they were vulnerable. Let's start with conflict. The 1601 Oñate expedition is one of the few recorded clashes between Spaniards and Etsanoa. Accounts describe tense encounters that ended violently. Even without Europeans, the region was a patchwork of alliances and rivalries. Apachean groups pressing from the west, Pawnee, and other Central Plains peoples from the north and east, and shifting coalitions of allies and enemies across the river valleys. The Wichita were skilled traders and negotiators, but no society exists without tension. Raiding, competition over hunting grounds, and disputes over trade routes could all have made the big towns increasingly risky places to remain. Then there's the silent invader, disease. Epidemics swept through North America ahead of Europeans, traveling faster than the explorers themselves. Smallpox, influenza, measles. Whatever the specific agent, the result was demographic collapse. Archaeologists can't dig a pit and find a microbe from the 1600s, but the timing aligns too neatly to ignore. Large, centralized towns like Etsanoa would have been especially vulnerable to contagion. If disease struck, population loss alone might have forced relocation. Fewer people to plant fields, fewer to defend walls, fewer to keep the rhythm of community life intact. Climate adds another twist. The 1600s marked the heart of the Little Ice Age, a period of unpredictable weather across the northern hemisphere. Kansas experienced drought cycles interspersed with harsh winters. Farming communities dependent on maize would have been stressed by unreliable rainfall. Even a few failed harvests could send ripple effects through an entire settlement network. Fields may have dried up, food stores may have dwindled, and migrations may have seemed like the only viable option. And finally, trade itself could have destabilized things. The arrival of European goods, metal tools, beads, guns, reshaped plains economies. Old routes shifted, and new dependencies formed. The Wichita found themselves intermediaries in a rapidly changing marketplace, their alliances tested by who controlled access to iron, cloth, or weapons. When the balance of trade shifted, so did the settlements. The truth is, No single factor explains the relocation of Quivira and Great Bend communities. It wasn't just conflict or just disease or just climate. It was all of these, layered, messy, and accelerating. The story isn't of collapse so much as adaptation under crushing pressure. The people did not vanish. They moved, reorganized, and eventually became the Wichita and related groups recorded later in history. What vanished was the stability of their great river towns, their sprawling fields, their sense of permanence in central Kansas. And what lingers today are fragments, villages gone, fields reabsorbed into prairie, oral traditions fractured by centuries. Yet the traces still whisper, carved into stone as petroglyphs, symbols etched on sandstone bluffs across the Smoky Hills. Which brings us to another mystery altogether. Who made those carvings and what exactly were they trying to say? 7. Who carved the Smoky Hills petroglyphs, Ellsworth, Rice, Russell, Ottawa counties, and exactly when? Drive through the Smoky Hills region of central Kansas, and the land seems plain enough. Rolling bluffs, weathered outcrops of Dakota sandstone, the kind of scenery you'd pass without a second glance if you weren't paying attention. But hidden in those rocks are marks that refuse to fade. Petroglyphs, carved images left by hands whose names are lost to time. Figures of animals, spirals, abstract motifs, human forms scratched into the stone. They linger as stubborn questions etched into the land. Who made them and when? At first glance, the answer should be simple. Archaeology thrives on attribution. Give us a style, give us a date, and we'll match it to a known culture. Yet the Smoky Hills carvings won't play along. Some scholars suggest they belong to the ancestors of the Wichita, who lived in the region during the late prehistoric and protohistoric periods. Others argue they could be the work of different plains groups passing through, perhaps ancestors of the Pawnee, or even early Apachean peoples. The sandstone doesn't give up identities, it only gives up lines. Dating them is an even greater headache. Unlike pottery or bone, sandstone carvings can't be carbon dated. Archaeologists rely on weathering patterns, lichen growth, or stylistic comparisons to petroglyphs elsewhere. These methods are approximate at best. Some carvings could be 1,000 years old, others just a few centuries. A handful might even date to the historic period, when European contact had already reshaped the plains. Without context, without tools, hearths, or organic material directly associated with the carvings, we're left guessing. The result, an entire gallery of prehistoric art floating untethered in time. The ambiguity invites interpretation, and interpretation invites projection. Some see bison forms and link them to hunting rituals. Others notice anthropomorphic figures and imagine shamans marking spiritual journeys. Still others focus on abstract shapes, spirals, grids, zigzags, and argue for celestial connections, maps of the sky scratched into stone. Each theory has evidence, each theory also lacks proof. And so the petroglyphs remain mirrors, reflecting whatever the observer most wants to find. There's also the question of purpose. Were these carvings meant for public display, teaching younger generations about hunting, ceremony, or mythology? Or were they private marks, the signatures of individuals making sense of the land? Petroglyphs are both communication and concealment. They show us symbols, but withhold the language that once unlocked them. Without that key, every explanation feels partial. What's clear is that carving sandstone isn't casual. It takes time, patience, and intent. Whoever made the Smoky Hills petroglyphs wanted permanence. They wanted their marks to last beyond their own lifetimes, to speak in silence across centuries. That goal has been achieved. The fact that we don't fully understand them only deepens their power. And yet, as much as we're haunted by who carved them and when, an even sharper question looms. What do the symbols mean? What were these ancestors actually trying to tell us with their spirals, their bison, their enigmatic figures etched into the Kansas stone? 8. What do the petroglyph symbols mean? A spiral, a bison, a stick figure human with outstretched arms, an abstract grid that looks like a checkerboard carved into a sandstone bluff miles from the nearest town. The Smoky Hills petroglyphs don't just ask you to look, they dare you to interpret. Every carved line is a message, but the code book is missing. So, what do the symbols mean? The temptation is to leap at explanations. Archaeologists, anthropologists, and local enthusiasts alike have tried. Some point to the obvious. Bison and elk figures must have been tied to hunting rituals. Maybe they were prayers carved into stone, asking for a successful chase. Maybe they were records of past hunts, the tally marks of survival. Others see spirals and concentric circles and argue for a cosmic reading. Spirals, after all, appear in rock art across the world, often linked to the sun, the stars, or the endless cycle of life and death. Could the Kansas spirals be the plains equivalent of a calendar, an attempt to map the sky onto stone? Still others suggest more personal meanings. Perhaps the carvings were territorial markers, warnings or invitations to other groups moving through the Smoky Hills. A line of human figures could signal, we live here. This is ours. Or conversely, we pass through. Remember us. Petroglyphs, in this view, were not art for art's sake but communication, a prehistoric billboard system etched into the cliffs. But then the skepticism sets in. Modern scholars warn against reading too much into symbols detached from their cultural context. A spiral to us might look like the sun, but to the carver it could have meant water, a journey, or even nothing more than a doodle with spiritual resonance. Without oral traditions tied specifically to these carvings, we're left in a fog. It's easy to project modern desires onto the stone. The desire for order, for narrative, for proof that the people of the past thought the way we think. And that projection is its own kind of mystery. The symbols endure precisely because they resist translation. They are messages meant for a community that no longer exists in its original form. Whispers frozen in sandstone. To decipher them is to eavesdrop across centuries without knowing the language. Every attempt at meaning reveals more about us than about the artists. We want them to be calendars, hunting records, maps, cosmologies, diaries. Maybe they were all of those at once. Maybe they were none. The uncertainty doesn't diminish the carvings, it amplifies them. Imagine standing in front of a sandstone wall at dusk, the light slanting across grooves made by hands hundreds of years ago. You feel the intent, the effort, the desire for permanence. You don't understand the message, but you know it mattered. That gap between knowing the symbols were vital and not knowing what they meant is the true weight of the mystery. And the weight grows heavier when you realize how incomplete our inventory is. For every petroglyph recorded, how many remain hidden in remote valleys? Or worse, lost to erosion, vandalism, or the slow crumble of sandstone? The next question isn't just what the symbols mean, but how many symbols we've already lost without ever having a chance to puzzle them out. 9. How many petroglyph sites remain undocumented or at risk? It's one thing to marvel at the Smoky Hills petroglyphs that we know about. It's another, far more unsettling thing to realize how many we might never see. Kansas sandstone is fragile. It flakes, it erodes, it crumbles under the weight of water and wind. Add in a few centuries of farming, quarrying, highway building, and the occasional human with a pocket knife and a bad sense of humor. And the result is a record that is both precious and precarious. The question isn't just how many carvings survive, but how many vanished before anyone thought to notice. Archaeologists admit the inventory is far from complete. New petroglyph sites still appear in survey reports, on private land in road cuts along canyon walls where cattle graze more often than tourists wander. Every discovery feels like a miracle. An overlooked wall suddenly reveals spirals and handprints under the right slant of sunlight. But for every miracle, there's a quiet tragedy. Panels worn too smooth to recognize, rocks blasted for construction, carvings scrawled over by modern initials and spray paint. Kansas doesn't advertise its rock art the way Arizona or Utah does, and perhaps that's part of the problem. The secrecy protects some sites, but leaves others unrecorded until it's too late. And yet, the sense of absence is almost louder than the presence. Petroglyphs cluster in certain counties: Ellsworth, Rice, Russell, Ottawa. But oral history and geology suggest there could be more, scattered well beyond these boundaries. Why would prehistoric artists restrict themselves to a handful of valleys when the entire Smoky Hills offered canvases of sandstone? The logical answer is they didn't. We simply haven't found the rest. Or if we did, we failed to recognize what we were looking at until weather or bulldozers erased the evidence. Erosion is relentless. A petroglyph might survive for centuries, only to dissolve within decades once its protective patina peels away. Even careful documentation, photos, wrappings, digital scans can't save the original. The carving itself, the tactile groove of stone under human hand, is destined to fade. Each undocumented site at risk isn't just another tally lost. It's another chapter of meaning erased, another voice silenced mid-sentence. Vandalism adds insult to inevitability. A carved deer from 500 years ago can vanish under the swipe of a spray-painted nickname in 5 seconds. Archaeologists groan about it, locals shake their heads, but the damage is irreversible. Once the groove is filled, chipped, or overlaid, the story it once told is gone. And so the catalogue of undocumented or at risk isn't theoretical, it's active, unfolding as we speak, which raises the uncomfortable irony. The mystery of Kansas rock art is as much about what we'll never know as what we already see. Every missing panel means another unanswered question about spirituality, cosmology, or daily life. The gaps loom as large as the carvings themselves, mocking our attempts at understanding. And if the missing record gnaws at us, one place makes it worse. Big Chip Cave in Comanche County. Unlike petroglyphs, it preserves faint pictographs, painted images rather than carved ones. But just like the carvings, the mystery multiplies. Who painted them and when? And why, of all places, in a gypsum cave on the Kansas plains? 10. Big Chip Cave pictographs, Comancheco. Who painted them and in which period? If petroglyphs are whispers carved into stone, then pictographs are more like fleeting breaths of color, fragile, vulnerable, barely surviving the centuries. And in Kansas, where sandstone crumbles and weather doesn't forgive, painted rock art is almost non-existent. Almost. Tucked away in Comanche County lies Big Chip Cave, one of the rare places in the state where faint pictographs, painted not carved, have been recorded. They sit in a gypsum cave, a setting both protective and precarious, offering us a rare glimpse into a vanished visual language. Yet the same questions that haunt all rock art loom here as well. Who painted them and when? The site itself has an aura of contradiction. On one hand, the cave's gypsum walls offered a kind of shield from wind and rain, preserving pigments longer than they would last on open cliffs. On the other hand, gypsum is a poor archivist. It crumbles, it peels, it absorbs moisture like a sponge. The paintings that survive are fragmentary, faint traces of shapes, outlines that suggest more than they confirm. Scholars squint at them, sketch them, photograph them in infrared, hoping to coax stories from what little pigment remains. The cave seems to resist every attempt at clarity, as if reminding us that history prefers to blur. Dating the paintings is its own labyrinth. Unlike carved petroglyphs, pictographs can in rare cases be directly dated if organic binders are present in the pigments. But at Big Chip Cave, no such luck, at least not yet. Archaeologists instead rely on stylistic comparison, matching the faded motifs to other known traditions across the plains. Some think the paintings could be late prehistoric, perhaps made by ancestors of the Wichita who farmed and hunted in the region. Others argue for Apachean origins, linking the imagery to Athabascan-speaking groups who entered the plains in the proto-historic era. Still others leave the question open, admitting the evidence is too thin to pin down. And what about the content itself? Accounts mention geometric shapes, animal forms, and perhaps even human-like figures, though the lines are so faint that imagination sometimes fills in more than the pigment. Did these images record hunting rituals, spiritual visions, clan symbols, or were they something as simple and human as a way of leaving a mark? Proof of presence in a landscape that could swallow you whole? The ambiguity turns the cave into a Rorschach test for scholars. Each theory says as much about the interpreter as it does about the art. What makes Big Jeep Cave especially haunting is its isolation. Unlike the Smoky Hills petroglyphs, which scatter across counties, this is the only securely recorded pictograph site in Kansas. If this is the lone survivor, how many others have already vanished? How many caves, bluffs, or overhangs once bore paintings that washed away centuries before anyone thought to look? The singularity of Big Jeep Cave amplifies its mystery. Is it a rare exception, or the last faint remnant of a much broader, now erased tradition? Either way, its survival is precarious. Every year, weather and time gnaw at the gypsum, threatening to erase what little pigment still clings. The cave is both archive and eraser, shelter and destroyer. Standing inside it, you feel the fragility of human expression, the way even the most deliberate marks can dissolve into silence. And yet, this single cave doesn't close the story, because Kansas has more rock art panels etched into sandstone cliffs and river valleys. If Big Jeep Cave leaves us wondering who painted, the Wilson Lake and Saline River petroglyphs push us further. Just how extensive are these panels, and what stories do they collectively tell? 11. The Wilson Lake Saline River petroglyphs. How far do they extend? And what stories do the panels collectively tell? Follow the Saline River west of Wilson Lake, and you'll find yourself in a landscape that feels deceptively ordinary. Sandstone cliffs broken by cedar and cottonwood, meandering water that rarely draws attention outside of drought years. But hidden in these outcrops are some of the most extensive collections of petroglyphs in Kansas. Panels carved into soft Dakota sandstone stretch across bluffs and canyon walls, often in clusters so dense that they resemble an ancient open-air gallery. The mystery here isn't whether they exist. Their presence is undeniable. The mystery is how far they extend and what the story of these collective panels was meant to convey. Archaeologists surveying the region have catalogued hundreds of individual carvings, spirals, crosses, bison, bird-like figures, handprints, geometric grids, even enigmatic humanoid shapes with outstretched arms. Each panel has its own rhythm, but together they suggest something larger than isolated doodles. They feel like chapters in a book, strung across miles of river valley, connected by themes we can sense but not translate. The carvings weren't scattered randomly. They seemed concentrated near forts, overlooks, and sheltered alcoves, places that likely mattered for travel, ritual, or gathering. Was the Saline River itself the unifying thread, a lifeline along which messages were left for those who passed through? The question of extent is particularly vexing. Every new survey seems to push the known boundary outward. Panels discovered in the 1970s are now joined by sites recorded in the 2000s, thanks to better access, landowner cooperation, and remote sensing. But there's no reason to think we've seen them all. Many cliffs remain unsurveyed, hidden on private property or covered by vegetation. Some panels are only visible when sunlight hits at the right angle. Others are fading so quickly that by the time they're noticed, the lines are nearly gone. The idea that an even larger network of carvings lies hidden beneath soil lichen or erosion feels less like speculation and more like inevitability. As for the stories they tell, scholars tread carefully. One theory casts the panels as a kind of visual narrative encoding hunting practices, spiritual journeys, and cosmological beliefs. A cluster of bison might have been a hunting prayer. A series of concentric circles could represent celestial cycles. Another theory emphasizes communication. Petroglyphs as territorial markers, signals to travelers about who lived here, what resources were nearby, or where sacred ground began. Yet another interpretation sees them as deeply personal. Visions of shamans, spiritual maps carved into stone after trance or ceremony. What makes the Wilson Lake Saline River panels especially intriguing is their density. When dozens of figures appear on a single wall, overlapping and crowding each other, the sense of community is overwhelming. These weren't idle sketches made in solitude. They were part of a shared tradition, a practice repeated over generations. The panels are less like individual paintings and more like communal murals, where each addition layered meaning onto an ever-growing canvas. And yet, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Taken collectively, the carvings feel like an atlas of thought, a worldview translated into stone, where animals, humans, and symbols blur into a single fabric. But without the original key, we can only guess at what story the atlas tells. The sheer scope of the Saline River carvings hints at ambition, but it also sets the stage for an even stranger creation. Because just a few counties away lies a single, deliberate earthwork, an enormous serpent carved into the ground itself. Unlike the panels, it doesn't sprawl in fragments. It coils with purpose. And the question that lingers is as unsettling as it is simple. Who made the lion serpent intaglio, and why does it guard an egg? 12. The lion serpent intaglio, rice corn. Who made this 160-foot serpent earthwork, and why the egg motif? Cosmology, lineage, territory. Sometimes the mysteries of Kansas cling to cliff sides carved in sandstone. Other times they stretch across the very earth itself. Near the town of Lyons in Rice County lies one of the strangest prehistoric enigmas on the plains, the lion serpent intaglio, a massive figure carved not upward like a mound but downward into the earth. Picture a sinuous serpent, 160 feet long, its coiled body cut into the soil, its head aimed toward an oval depression, interpreted by many as an egg. This is not erosion, not an accident of geology. This is deliberate, and that makes the questions unavoidable. Who created it, and why? The first clue lies in the sheer uniqueness of the site. Kansas, unlike Ohio or Wisconsin, is not generally associated with earthworks. The effigy mounds of the Midwest are well known, from the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio to bird and bear forms scattered across the Mississippi Valley. But in Kansas, these monuments are virtually absent, except for the lion serpent. That makes it either an outlier or a lost example of a broader tradition that once reached farther west than we assume. Either way, the mystery grows heavier. The serpent motif itself demands interpretation. Across North America, Serpents appear as powerful symbols. Water, fertility, underworld forces, renewal. In some traditions, the snake devours its own tail, embodying the endless cycle of life and death. In others, serpents guard treasures or sacred sites, warning intruders with their coiled thread. The egg carved at lions complicates the image even more. Is it a cosmological reference, a cosmic egg from which the world was born, guarded by a primal serpent? Is it a lineage symbol marking fertility and descent? Or was it territorial, a monumental claim staked on the Kansas prairie to warn outsiders that this land was spoken for? No records tell us. No oral tradition has survived to confirm authorship. Some archaeologists cautiously link the intaglio to the Great Bend aspect or related ancestral Wichita groups, noting that its location sits within the heart of Quivira country. Others hedge, suggesting it could be tied to influences from the Mississippi Valley, where earthworks were a common expression of ritual and cosmology. Without datable artifacts buried in or beneath the carving, the debate remains open. What's perhaps most haunting is the fragility of the site. Unlike mounds built upward, intaglios are depressions, shallow by design. Over centuries they fill with silt, blur under vegetation and disappear into the landscape. Early accounts describe the lion serpent more clearly than we see it today. Photographs and surveys have kept its memory alive, but the carving itself has suffered under time and agriculture. It's possible that other intaglios once existed in Kansas, erased before anyone recognized them. If lions is the last survivor, then we're staring at a one-of-a-kind portal into a worldview otherwise invisible. Standing at the site, even now, when its form is faint, you feel both the ambition and the enigma. Someone, centuries ago, marshaled enough labor to carve a monumental serpent into the prairie. It wasn't for subsistence, it wasn't for shelter, it was for meaning. But what meaning? Was it a prayer for water, a guardian of fertility, a declaration of belonging? Or was it something we can't even imagine, a symbol whose cultural logic evaporated long ago? And if a single earthwork can leave us so disoriented, consider the countless smaller imprints of daily life scattered across the plains. Circles of stones pressed into the soil, arranged in rings where teepees once stood. They are humbler than the lion serpent, but no less mysterious. Who made them? And what do they reveal about the fleeting lives that pass across the Kansas prairie? 13. Teepee rings are stone circles on the high plains, e.g. Elliscone. Which groups left them and what specific activities do they represent at each cluster? If the lion's serpent intaglio feels like a grand gesture carved for eternity, the teepee rings scattered across the high plains feel like the opposite. Fleeting practical traces of daily life, left unintentionally permanent. They are simple, circles of stones pressed into the earth, usually between 10 and 30 feet across. Yet behind their simplicity lies an entire way of life. These rings, found in Ellis County and beyond, are the footprints of teepees, portable homes anchored against the relentless Kansas wind. They are also one of the most abundant yet least understood archaeological signatures in the region. At first, the explanation seems obvious. Plains peoples, both prehistoric and historic, built conical dwellings from wooden poles covered in hides. To keep them steady, stones were placed around the base. When the camp moved on, the stones remained, forming rings. Multiply this by centuries, and the Kansas prairie becomes littered with silent stone circles. Campsites without campers, houses without households. But the deeper archaeologists look, the less straightforward the rings become. For one, not all stone circles are equal. Some are small, neat, and uniform, likely the base of a family-sized dwelling. Others are large, irregular, or clustered so tightly that they suggest community gatherings or extended stays. Certain sites show dozens of rings together, a ghost village arranged across a ridge or valley floor. Others appear isolated, a single circle standing lonely against the grass. The variation hints at different purposes: hunting camps, seasonal villages, rendezvous points, maybe even ceremonial stops. The stones whisper of lives lived in motion, yet rooted enough to leave marks. Attribution is equally murky. Which groups left them? The short answer is many. Archaeologists link some rings to late prehistoric plains villagers who supplemented farming with bison hunts. Others clearly belong to mobile groups of the proto-historic and historic periods: Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, Arapaho. The problem is that stones don't come with labels. A teepee ring looks the same whether it was laid down in AD 1200 or 1800. Unless artifacts like pottery, tools, or trade goods are found nearby, the circles float untethered in time. And even when artifacts are found, interpretation isn't simple. A cluster of stone circles with a few scattered flakes might mark a temporary stop during a hunting expedition. A larger cluster with hearths, storage pits, or children's toys could represent a longer seasonal encampment. Yet both scenarios leave identical rings. Without the full archaeological context, a circle of rocks could mean an evening or an entire season. The ambiguity is maddening and humbling. But perhaps that's the point. The rings remind us that mobility leaves different kinds of permanence. The builders of grass house villages like Etsanoa left post holes and storage pits. The builders of teepees left circles of stones. Both were adaptations to place. Both were homes. Both demanded labor and care. The difference is scale, not importance. To walk among teepee rings today is to feel the uncanny presence of absence. You can almost picture the smoke rising from a hearth, the sound of children playing, the bustle of hides being stretched and dried. Then you blink, and all that remains are stones pressed into prairie sod. Their silence feels deliberate, as if the land itself insists that memory should fade. And yet, sometimes, memory clings to places in ways that are harder to erase. One such place was Wakonda Springs, a site once considered sacred, now submerged beneath the waters of Wakonda Lake. What ceremonies unfolded there, and what traces of them remain hidden under the reservoir's surface. 14. Wakonda Springs, now beneath Wakonda Lake. What ceremonies and intertribal interactions unfolded at this sacred place over centuries, and what archaeological traces remain submerged. Imagine a pool of turquoise water bubbling from the Kansas prairie, perfectly round, perfectly clear, and seemingly bottomless. That was Wakanda Springs before the 1960s, when it was drowned beneath the reservoir now called Wakanda Lake. For centuries, people came to this place. They camped nearby, left offerings, told stories about its healing powers, and considered it sacred ground. Early settlers heard native oral traditions describing the spring as holy long before it became a spa destination for Euro-American tourists. Now it lies submerged, a sacred site turned ghost, its mysteries muffled beneath water and concrete. The very shape of Wakanda Springs set it apart. Rising more than 300 feet across, with mineral-rich water seeping upward, it was no ordinary pond. Native traditions from tribes including the Wichita, Pawnee, and Kansas speak of the spring as a place where the worlds touched, where the earthly met the spiritual. Offerings were said to have been made there, beads, tools, ornaments, food. Some reports suggest that intertribal gatherings occurred around the spring, the kind of ceremonial diplomacy that turned a geographic oddity into a shared holy site. Like the council circle at Etsanoa, Wakanda Springs was not just a place, but a stage on which cosmology, community, and politics intertwined. Archaeological evidence hints at the depth of its use. Artifacts recovered from around the spring before the reservoir drowned it suggest activity spanning centuries. Projectile points, pottery fragments, beads, and historic period trade goods all surfaced. These finds confirmed that Wakanda was more than a watering hole. It was a magnet across eras. Its mineral waters were valued not just for ceremony, but for their practical and medicinal qualities. By the 19th century, settlers had seized on the spring's reputation, building resorts and bathhouses to capitalize on what native people had already known. The water mattered, but in doing so, they also obscured and commercialized a tradition that had stretched long before. When the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built Glen Elder Dam in the 1960s, the spring was deliberately submerged. Preservation was not the priority. Flood control and recreation were. Whatever ceremonial deposits once rested at the bottom are now out of reach, sealed beneath layers of sediment and lake water. What archaeological traces remain? Possibly much. Wooden posts, artifacts, offerings. But unless the reservoir were drained, they will remain speculative, tantalizingly close, and impossibly far. Wakanda Springs has shifted from a site you could stand at and feel to one you can only imagine. And yet, that very inaccessibility deepens its mystery. A sacred site once public to all is now hidden, transformed into a paradox, preserved by submersion, erased by development. When you look across Wakanda Lake today, you're staring at an absence you can't recover, a sacred center now silenced. The water hides answers we may never reclaim. But Wakanda isn't the only Kansas water mystery that refuses to dry up. Just a few miles away lies St. Jacob's Well, a sinkhole pool in the little basin that has baffled generations with one simple enduring fact. No matter how many droughts sweep the plains, it has never been known to go dry. Why? 15. St. Jacob's Well, little basin. Why has this sinkhole pool never been known to go dry? And how does its groundwater system work through drought cycles? The High Plains has a way of keeping secrets. In a region where rivers vanish underground, where dust storms erase trails, and where drought has humbled even the most ambitious irrigation projects, there sits a pool of water that refuses to play by the rules. St. Jacob's Well, located in the Little Basin of Clark County, is a circular sinkhole roughly 84 feet across, ringed by limestone cliffs and cloaked in prairie grass. Local ranchers, tourists, and geologists alike have marveled at it for generations because of one stubborn fact. In living memory, it has never gone dry, not once. That claim sounds simple, but on the high plains, it borders on the miraculous. This is a land where the Ogallala Aquifer is pumped relentlessly for crops, where ponds crack into mud flats during dry summers, and where rivers often fail to reach their historic banks. And yet St. Jacob's Well sits in defiance of all that. Stories go back to the 19th century of settlers watering cattle here, of travelers filling canteens, of locals swearing by the pool's reliability, even in the harshest droughts. While other water sources disappeared, the well endured, like a liquid paradox carved into the gypsum bedrock. So how does it work? Geologists argue that the well is tied to a complex groundwater system in the underlying Permian rocks. The sinkhole likely connects to subterranean fractures or conduits that tap into deeper aquifers, replenishing the pool even when surface water vanishes. In theory, rainfall infiltrates through porous layers, feeding the well from below rather than above. But in theory, doesn't quite satisfy the mystery, because no one has fully mapped the hydrology. Attempts to measure its depth have produced inconsistent results. Some reports claim it plunges over 50 feet. Others insist it narrows into chambers impossible to probe with standard equipment. The well has an uncanny ability to resist easy quantification, as if guarding its own secret plumbing system. Legends swirl around the well too. Some stories claim it is bottomless, an endless conduit into the underworld. Others insist its waters are enchanted, offering protection or healing. Even scientists, while quick to dismiss the folklore, admit that the persistence of water here borders on the uncanny. In a landscape shaped by scarcity, St. Jacob's Well feels like abundance hiding in plain sight. And it isn't just about water. The pool's permanence made it a natural gathering point. Archaeological evidence suggests native peoples visited the site for centuries, perhaps treating it as a sacred or strategic stopover. In later times, cowboys and ranchers came to rely on it as a dependable oasis in a land where dependability was rare. Each layer of history adds another dimension to the mystery. The well isn't only a geological oddity, it's a cultural landmark that has anchored human presence in the region. But permanence can also be misleading. Just a few miles away, another basin tells a very different story. Big Basin, a massive circular depression, looks so much like an impact crater that for decades people swore it must have been formed by a meteor. Today, geologists explain it differently, but the debate over its origins is far from finished. 16. Big Basin. It's explained today as a gypsum/salt dissolution sinkhole, but its near-perfect circular shape fueled a long impact crater debate. Fully settled, stand on the rim of Big Basin in Clark County, Kansas, and the land suddenly drops away. A circular depression nearly a mile across yawns below, its floor now a grassland bowl dotted with wildlife. At first glance, it looks like something that doesn't belong on the plains at all. Too neat, too perfect, too much like a scar from the heavens. Early visitors certainly thought so. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, Big Basin was rumored to be a meteor crater, a colossal dent left when something fiery slammed into Kansas from the sky. After all, what else could carve such a round hole in an otherwise flat sea of prairie? But geology, as it often does, stepped in with a different story. Big Basin, most experts now argue, is not an impact crater but a sinkhole. An enormous one, formed when underground layers of salt and gypsum dissolved over millennia, causing the overlying land to collapse. Kansas is riddled with sinkholes, thanks to its soluble bedrock. Most are modest, small depressions or ponds scattered across the high plains. Big Basin is simply the largest and most dramatic, a sinkhole on steroids. The nearly perfect circularity that once fooled observers into thinking impact crater can be explained, geologists say, by the way collapsed structures spread evenly when dissolution occurs in a broad subsurface cavity. Yet the suspicion lingers that roundness still looks suspiciously extraterrestrial. And so the debate never entirely disappeared. It just quieted into a tug of war between science and spectacle. Geologists with core samples and chemical analyses point confidently to dissolution. Enthusiasts with an eye for cosmic drama still raise an eyebrow. Why this basin here, so large and symmetrical in a land where most sinkholes look irregular and messy? If dissolution explains Big Basin, why don't we see more near-perfect circles of this size scattered across the plains? Adding to the mystery is the basin's cultural weight. Indigenous groups knew the feature long before geologists puzzled over it. Oral traditions connected it to the landscape's spiritual fabric. Later, settlers wove their own lore, some insisting it was a meteor scar, others treating it as a natural amphitheater shaped for some unknown purpose. Today, tourists who hike the rim still feel that uncanny tug, part geological curiosity, part cosmic question mark. The land itself seems to invite speculation, daring you to believe that something spectacular happened here, even if the official answer is less glamorous. In practical terms, the sinkhole explanation holds up. Surveys of the subsurface show layers of soluble gypsum and salt deposits, precisely the kind of materials that collapse into voids when groundwater eats away at them, water running through fractures over thousands of years would have hollowed the bedrock, eventually causing the dramatic collapse we now call Big Basin. The fact that nearby features like Little Basin and St. Jacob's Well share similar geological origins strengthens the case. But what's striking is how reluctant people are to let go of the meteor theory. Maybe it's because impact craters carry a certain drama linking Kansas to the grand cosmic stage. A sinkhole is local, ordinary chemical. A meteor is universal, catastrophic, a reminder that Earth is vulnerable. Big Basin's mystery, then, is not just geological, it's psychological. We want the hole in the ground to mean more than slow chemistry. We want it to be a scar from the stars. And if the debate over a simple hole in the ground can feel unresolved, imagine the puzzle when fossils enter the picture. Just east of Big Basin lies Hamilton Quarry, a site that doesn't just hint at catastrophe. It preserves an entire ecosystem in exquisite detail, frozen in stone. How exactly did so many creatures end up entombed together in this early Permian Lagerstätte? 17. Hamilton Quarry, Greenwood County. Lagerstätte. What precise sequence of events produced its extraordinary mix of early Permian plants, fishes, amphibians, and reptiles in one place? Some fossil sites give you bones. Hamilton Quarry gives you a world. Tucked into Greenwood County, this limestone deposit from the early Permian period, roughly 290 million years ago, is one of those rare Lagerstätten sites of exceptional preservation that capture not just isolated skeletons, but entire ecosystems. Fish, amphibians, reptiles, insects, plants, all entombed together in layers that read like the pages of a prehistoric scrapbook. To walk through the quarry's fossil slabs in a museum is to feel like you've stumbled into a time capsule. Yet the most basic question remains unsettled. What exact sequence of events produced such remarkable preservation? The fossils themselves are extraordinary, delicate impressions of dragonflies with wings intact, amphibians preserved in lifelike poses, reptiles with their skeletons articulated rather than scattered, plants still showing details of leaves and fronds. This isn't the usual fossil record of broken bones and isolated teeth. This is a snapshot of an entire community caught mid-moment. And that level of detail demands an explanation. How could so many organisms from different habitats, water, swamp, forest floor, end up buried together in the same limestone layers? The leading theory points to a dramatic but localized catastrophe. During the Permian, this part of Kansas lay near the edge of an inland sea, with rivers, swamps, and coastal environments shifting back and forth over time. A sudden flood event, perhaps triggered by storms or rapid sea level changes, could have swept organisms from different habitats into a single basin. Rapid burial in fine sediments would have sealed them off from scavengers and decay, creating the conditions for exceptional fossilization. The mix of aquatic and terrestrial life in the same strata seems to support this. Fish alongside land reptiles, tree fragments beside insects. It's as if a violent pulse of water shoved an entire cross-section of the environment into one place and slammed the door. But flood models don't answer everything. Why are the fossils so exquisitely preserved, with details usually lost in turbulent deposits? Some researchers suggest that after the initial sweep of organisms, the basin's conditions turn stagnant. Low oxygen, little disturbance, essentially a natural embalming chamber. In this view, the preservation wasn't just about rapid burial, but about what came after. A quiet, anoxic lagoon that protected bodies from decay until mineralization locked them in stone. Others emphasize microbial activity, proposing that bacterial mats coated and stabilized remains before they could disintegrate. And then there's the possibility that the story wasn't one event but many, a series of floods and stagnant intervals, layering catastrophe upon catastrophe, until the quarry became a composite of multiple mass die-offs. If true, Hamilton Quarry isn't a single snapshot, but an album of disasters, each one capturing another slice of Permian life. The beauty of Hamilton Quarry lies in this tension. Every fossil is clear enough to feel personal, like the dragonfly wings that still look ready to flutter, but the broader mechanism of preservation remains blurred. Catastrophe or calm, single event or recurring cycles, the fossils whisper both, refusing to commit to one story. And if Hamilton Quarry shows us life caught in extraordinary detail, the Elmo insect beds go even further. There, entire swarms of lower Permian insects, fragile creatures rarely preserved at all, lie fossilized in uncanny perfection. How could such delicate bodies survive nearly 300 million years? That puzzle is next. 18. Elmo insect beds, Wellington FM. Why are lower Permian insects preserved so exquisitely here? And what does that say about the paleo environment? The trouble with insects is that they are terrible at becoming fossils. Bones, shells, teeth, those survive the ages. But wings as thin as paper, bodies built from delicate chitin. Normally they dissolve, vanish, or flatten into unrecognizable smudges long before sediment can entomb them. That's what makes the Elmo insect beds in Dickinson County such an outlier. Here, they're in the shales of the lower Permian Wellington Formation. Entire swarms of insects are preserved in such exquisite detail that paleontologists can see the veins in their wings, the segmentation in their abdomens, even the delicate outlines of antennae. It's as if someone pressed dragonflies, mayflies, cockroaches, and more into a stone scrapbook nearly 290 million years ago. The scale of the site is staggering. Since the late 19th century, collectors have pulled tens of thousands of insect fossils from Elmo, representing more than 150 species. Dragonflies the size of dinner plates, cockroaches both familiar and bizarre, mayflies caught mid-life cycle, even early relatives of grasshoppers, all of them etched into shale with uncanny clarity. To hold a slab from Elmo is to feel like you've stumbled across the imprint of a summer swarm, frozen mid-flight. So how did this happen? Why here, and not in countless other lakes, swamps, and rivers, where insects surely lived and died? The prevailing theory is that Elmo's paleo environment created the perfect storm of conditions for insect preservation. Imagine a shallow lake or lagoon with fine clay sediments settling quietly to the bottom. The water, at least periodically, may have been stratified, oxygen-rich at the surface, oxygen poor, or even anoxic below. When insects died and sank, they slipped into those oxygen-starved layers, safe from scavengers and decay. Fine sediment buried them quickly, sealing their fragile bodies before they could disintegrate. But this explanation, while neat, leaves open questions. Why are the fossils so consistently well preserved across such a broad area? Why do we see both mass accumulations and solitary individuals in equally exquisite condition? Some researchers suggest sudden die-offs, perhaps linked to toxic algal blooms or abrupt changes in water chemistry, swept large numbers of insects into the lake. Others imagine calmer scenarios where seasonal winds or storms deposited unlucky swarms into the water en masse. In either case, the fossils hint not just at unusual preservation but at unusual ecological dynamics, an environment that both nurtured vast insect populations and killed them under peculiar circumstances. The implications stretch beyond insects themselves. These fossils help reconstruct the Permian landscape of Kansas. Dragonflies and mayflies indicate water bodies capable of sustaining aquatic larvae. Cockroaches, abundant at Elmo, suggest dense vegetation nearby to feed their omnivorous appetites. The diversity captured in the shale reflects a world on the brink of change. The Permian was the last act before Earth's greatest mass extinction, when 90% of species would vanish. In the Elmo beds we glimpse a vibrant prelude, a buzzing chorus fossilized just before the curtain began to fall. And perhaps that's what makes Elmo so mysterious. It shouldn't exist. By all normal rules, insects don't fossilize like this. That they did here tells us something extraordinary about the chemistry and ecology of the time. Something we only partly understand. If Elmo captures life in uncanny miniature, the Niobrara and Smoky Hill chalk formations take us in the opposite direction. Fossil record dominated not by insects but by giants. Mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, pterosaurs, and more are found in staggering concentrations. Why Kansas should yield such a jackpot of marine megafauna remains one of paleontology's enduring puzzles. 19. Niobrara's Smoky Hill. Chalk megafauna jackpot. Why do Kansas outcrops yield such dense concentrations of mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, pterosaurs, birds, and giant fishes? Takes a peculiar imagination to picture western Kansas not as a sea of grass, but as literal sea, waves rolling over what is now farmland, predators gliding through waters where cattle graze today. Yet during the late Cretaceous, about 80 million years ago, that's exactly what this region was. Part of the Western Interior Seaway, a shallow ocean stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic. The Niobrara Formation, especially the Smoky Hill chalk member, preserves this watery world with unnerving abundance. Nowhere else on Earth do we find such dense concentrations of marine megafauna. Mosasaurs with jaws like bear traps, plesiosaurs with necks longer than fishing poles, pterosaurs that skimmed the waves, ancient seabirds with teeth, and giant predatory fishes like Siphacinus, longer than a compact car. The Smoky Hill chalk is not just fossiliferous, it is absurdly fossiliferous. Why? Part of the answer lies in geology. Chalk is nothing more than compacted plankton. Billions upon billions of microscopic coccolithophores that rained down to the seafloor over millions of years. The Smoky Hill deposits accumulated in relatively quiet, low-energy waters, where fine sediments buried carcasses gently rather than scattering them. That quietness created the potential for preservation. But preservation alone doesn't explain density. We still need to ask, why were so many giants dying here in this particular stretch of sea? One theory points to geography. The western interior seaway narrowed in the central U.S., creating a natural bottleneck where currents, nutrients, and prey converged. Think of it as a prehistoric version of a watering hole, except the water hole was the size of a state, and the animals were mosasaurs and giant fish. Abundant plankton fed smaller fish, which in turn fed larger fish, which attracted apex predators. The Smoky Hill chalk, in this sense, is the fossil record of a food chain in overdrive, concentrated by geography into a hunting ground of unusual richness. But geography doesn't explain the clustering of so many intact skeletons. That suggests rapid burial events, possibly triggered by sudden anoxic conditions in the water. If oxygen levels plummeted near the bottom, massive die-offs could occur, sweeping predators and prey alike into watery graves. Some layers of the Smoky Hill chalk hint at such events. Stacked carcasses, articulated skeletons, and unusual preservation patterns that look less like random attrition and more like ecological disasters captured in real time. And yet, the debate isn't settled. Other researchers argue the abundance is an illusion of time. The chalk spans millions of years. What feels like a dense, catastrophic concentration might actually be the cumulative result of slow, steady death over immense spans, like seeing a cemetery and assuming everyone died on the same day. The difference between catastrophe and accumulation is hard to untangle when your timeline runs in millions. Whatever the mechanism, the Smoky Hill chalk remains a paradoxical place where predators outnumber prey in the fossil record, where flightless seabirds with teeth rest alongside winged pterosaurs, where marine reptiles large enough to swallow sharks seem to die almost in each other's company. It is an ossuary without equal, a chalky library of bones written in deep time. And sometimes those bones tell stranger stories still, like the infamous fossil of a giant predatory fish with another fish inside its stomach, preserved mid-meal. Was this fish within a fish an everyday occurrence in the Cretaceous seas of Kansas, or a rare moment of overreach captured by chance? 20. The fish within a fish, Scyphactinus. Did over-ambitious predation routinely kill these giants, or was this a rare event captured by extraordinary preservation? Few fossils capture the imagination like the fish within the fish from the Smoky Hill chalk. On the surface, it looks straightforward. The skeleton of a giant predatory fish called Scyphactinus audax, with the near-complete remains of another large fish, Gylicus arcuatus, still preserved in its stomach cavity. The fossil is so clear that you can see the smaller fish's outline tucked neatly inside the rib cage of its killer, like a morbid set of Russian nesting dolls. It is the kind of fossil that stops you cold because it doesn't just preserve anatomy, it preserves a moment. Something ate something else, and the act of eating itself set the stage for death. Cyphactinus was no ordinary fish. Reaching lengths of 15 to 20 feet, it was one of the apex predators of the late Cretaceous seas. Long, torpedo-shaped, with jaws lined in sharp, recurved teeth, it was built for speed and violence. Imagine a cross between a tarpon and a barracuda, then double it in size. It lived in a world teeming with prey, from small schooling fish to juvenile mosasaurs. The fossil of a Cyphactinus with a whole Gallicus in its belly shows us not just its appetite, but its apparent lack of moderation. The swallowed fish was nearly 6 feet long, hardly a snack. So was this recklessness normal behavior or a tragic exception? Some paleontologists suggest that Cyphactinus routinely overestimated its swallowing capacity. Like modern groupers or pythons, it may have been able to stretch its jaws and stomach wide enough to engulf prey nearly half its size. But just because it could didn't mean it always should. A struggling fish inside the predator's gut could rupture organs, interfere with swimming, or simply exhaust the predator before digestion took over. In this reading, the fossil represents death by overeating, a Cretaceous case of ambition exceeding ability. Others caution against generalizing from one spectacular specimen. Perhaps this was an unlucky individual, a rare miscalculation preserved only because burial conditions were ideal. After all, most meals don't fossilize. Countless Cyphactinus must have eaten large prey and digested them without issue. What makes this fossil special is not the act itself, but its preservation. A geological coincidence that froze an otherwise unremarkable event. In that sense, the fish within a fish is less about overambition being common and more about fossilization being selective. And then there's the philosophical sting. The fossil forces us to confront the thin line between survival and self-destruction. The predator, in trying to sustain itself, triggered its own death. Was it a metaphor written in chalk long before humans could read it? Or was it simply nature's trial and error at work, the same kind of gamble animals still make today when chasing prey that may be too big, too dangerous, or too costly? What's certain is that the fossil turned Kansas chalk into global headlines. Museums display replicas with pride, and visitors stare with equal parts fascination and disbelief. A fossil that captures not just a skeleton, but a fatal mistake is rare, and the Smoky Hill chalk doesn't stop there. Just as Cyphactinus leaves us wondering about predation gone wrong, the flying reptiles of the same deposits raise a different riddle altogether. Their spectacular head crests, those strange, exaggerated structures, have baffled scientists for over a century. Were they for species recognition, streamlining, or showy sexual display? 21. Pteranodon crests in the Kansas chalk, sexual display, species ID streamlining. Or multiple roles. There are few silhouettes in paleontology more striking than that of Pteranodon. Long wings stretched for soaring, toothless beak jutting forward, and behind it all, the unmistakable crest. Some species sported a spike as long as the head itself, sweeping backward in a dramatic arc. Others had shorter, more mollusc versions. For more than a century, these crests have been a subject of speculation, and Kansas, with its Smoky Hill chalk, has provided more pteranodon specimens than anywhere else on Earth. Dozens of skeletons, some complete, others fragmentary, lie entombed in those chalky layers. Together, they pose a question that refuses to die. What were the crests for? The first theory is aerodynamic. Early paleontologists assumed the crests must have functioned as stabilizers, counterweights to balance the long beak in flight. It seems sensible. Birds and planes often use vertical surfaces for control, so why not pteranodon? But computer models and wind tunnel tests have complicated this tidy story. Aerodynamic benefits from the crest appear minimal, and in some cases the large crests may have even increased drag. They weren't necessarily useless in flight, but streamlining alone doesn't justify the extravagant shapes we see. That brings us to sexual selection. Many researchers now suspect the crests were more about show than function. Plumes of bone advertising vitality, health, or attractiveness to potential mates. Larger crests could have signaled stronger individuals, much like a peacock's tail. The variation in crest size between specimens has been interpreted as evidence for sexual dimorphism. Perhaps males flaunted enormous headgear while females carried subtler versions. It fits a familiar evolutionary pattern, though fossil evidence is messy. Not all size differences map neatly onto sex, and some crests don't conform to the expected male big female small division. Another idea is species or individual recognition. In a seaway teeming with pteranodon colonies, crests might have served as visual identifiers, allowing individuals to distinguish mates, rivals, or family members at a distance. In this light, the crest was less about attracting attention universally and more about communicating within the species, like a natural billboard on the horizon. The trouble is proving this without direct behavioral evidence. We can model flight, we can measure bones, but we can't ask a pteranodon whether it recognizes its neighbor by the angle of its headgear. And then there's the possibility of multifunctionality. Evolution rarely designs features for just one purpose. The crest may have carried subtle aerodynamic effects, assisted with thermoregulation, signaled sexual fitness, and aided in recognition all at once. Its role could have shifted depending on context, useful in flight, crucial in courtship, conspicuous in colony life. The very ambiguity might be the point. It was a Swiss Army knife of bone, doing many jobs imperfectly but together shaping the life of the animal. Kansas fossils don't answer the question, but they keep it alive. Each new specimen adds variation, different crest lengths, angles, and proportions, without delivering a definitive pattern. The crests stare back from the rock, bold and inexplicable, reminders that even the most iconic features can resist explanation. And while Pteranodon leaves us guessing about display versus function, the giant mosasaurs of the same chalk add a different twist. Their preserved stomach contents suggest wide-ranging diets. But were these apex hunters opportunists grabbing whatever they could, or specialists with finely tuned strategies? 22. Tylosaurus stomach contents show diverse prey. But were these apex hunters specialized or opportunistic? If Pteranodon was the sky's signature figure over the western interior seaway, Tylosaurus was its heavyweight below. Stretching up to 45 feet long, with a skull packed full of recurved teeth, Tylosaurus was a mosasaur, the undisputed top predator in the Kansas chalk seas. Nothing short of another mosasaur could challenge it, but being the biggest hunter raises a new kind of puzzle. What exactly did it eat? Thanks to an unusual quirk of fossilization, we actually know. Several Kansas specimens preserve stomach contents, offering direct evidence of last meals. The problem is, those meals are all over the map. Fish, sharks, birds, turtles, even other mosasaurs. Tylosaurus seems to have swallowed anything it could overpower. So the question lingers. Was it a specialized apex hunter fine-tuned for certain prey, or an opportunistic generalist grabbing whatever floated by? The fossil evidence is tantalizing. One specimen contained the remains of a flightless seabird, a creature that must have skimmed the ocean's surface before ending up in the mosasaur's jaws. Another had the carapace of a turtle shattered and digested. Yet another preserved fish bones, and still another showed evidence of a smaller mosasaur, suggesting cannibalism. The diversity of prey categories is remarkable. It looks less like a curated menu and more like a buffet rated at will. If Tylosaurus was indeed an opportunist, it paints a picture of an animal that dominated its ecosystem through flexibility. Opportunistic predators thrive in variable environments, adjusting their diet depending on what's available. In a seaway filled with shifting populations, migrating fish schools, nesting seabirds, juvenile reptiles, this would have been a successful strategy. Instead of specializing and risking starvation when prey populations fluctuated, Tylosaurus could simply switch targets. It may have been less a lion and more a bear, eating whatever the season offered as long as it could be subdued. Yet some paleontologists argue for nuance. The skull and jaws of Tylosaurus were not just generic crushing tools. They were adapted for rapid strikes and deep bites. Its streamlined body suggests pursued predation, and its robust teeth could puncture tough shells. That combination might point toward targeted hunting strategies. Perhaps turtles and large fish were its bread and butter, while birds and mosasaurs were incidental. In this view, the stomach contents don't reflect everyday diets so much as exceptions preserved by chance. The real challenge is perspective. Fossils preserve moments, not averages. One last meal caught in chalk doesn't prove dietary habits. It only proves possibility. Multiply this across several specimens and patterns start to emerge, but the sample size is still small compared to the diversity of life in the seaway. Were the bird and turtle meals rare indulgences, or were they common enough to define the species' lifestyle? Without thousands of specimens, we're left extrapolating from fragments. What makes the question so compelling is its broader implication. How do top predators structure ecosystems? If Tylosaurus was a specialist, then the seaway food web was tightly organized, with apex predators finely tuned to their niches. If it was an opportunist, the web was more chaotic, with predators dictating terms by sheer dominance. Either way, the fossils tell us the seas of Kansas were no gentle paradise. They were arenas of constant risk, where even flightless birds weren't safe. And while the bones of giants dominate headlines, the chalk holds another mystery, quieter but no less significant. Stone itself. The Smoky Hill region contains silicified chalk, sometimes called niobrarite, that native peoples used as tool stone. But how far was this strange material quarried and traded across the plains? 23. Smoky Hill silicified chalk, niobrarite, as tool stone. How widely was it quarried and traded by plains peoples? When people think of the Smoky Hill chalk, they usually picture fossils. Mosasaurs, coiled in stone, pterosaurs, frozen mid-flight, or the infamous fish within a fish. But ancient Kansans saw something else entirely. Not just the bones inside the chalk, but the chalk itself. Specifically, the silicified chalk, sometimes called niobrarite. This wasn't ordinary rock. Through geological quirks, the calcium carbonate of the Niobrara Formation in certain places had been infused with silica, producing a flinty, durable stone ideal for knapping into tools. On the plains, where high-quality tool stone was as valuable as gold, this material mattered. The question is, how far did it travel? And how widely did it circulate in prehistoric trade networks? The first puzzle is recognition. Silicified chalk isn't as immediately distinctive as obsidian, which stands out by its volcanic glass sheen, or as Flint Hill's chert, which carries a recognizable toughness and luster. Niobrarite can be subtle, gray tan, sometimes mottled, with a texture that shifts depending on where it was quarried. Archaeologists can identify it in the field by careful petrographic analysis or chemical sourcing, but it doesn't leap out at the casual observer. That means much of its prehistoric footprint could still be hidden, misclassified, or overlooked in museum collections. How much of the stone scattered across plains sites is niobrarite, mislabeled as generic chert? No one knows for sure. Still, enough has been identified to confirm that it was used. Knives, scrapers, projectile points and flakes have all been traced back to Smoky Hill silicified chalk sources. These weren't just utilitarian tools, they were survival. On the high plains, where bison hunting and hide processing were daily necessities, a sharp, reliable edge was the difference between thriving and struggling. The fact that niobrarite could be knapped into serviceable implements meant it held value, even if it wasn't the absolute highest quality stone compared to Flint Hill's chert or Knife River flint from the Dakotas. The real mystery is movement. Did local groups quarry and use the stone primarily within the Smoky Hills, or did it circulate farther? Preliminary sourcing studies suggest at least some trade. Niobrarite artifacts have been reported well outside the immediate Smoky Hill region, hinting that it moved along with bison products, shells, and other goods in the vast exchange networks that connected plains societies. But just how far it traveled is still under investigation. Was it a regional commodity exchanged between neighbors across central Kansas? Or was it part of long-distance systems that stretched hundreds of miles, carrying Smoky Hill stone into Oklahoma, Nebraska, or beyond. Here, the uncertainty deepens. Trade on the plains was rarely linear. It was web-like, with goods moving hand to hand, sometimes covering vast distances without the original source being remembered or acknowledged. A piece of neobrarite might show up in a camp 200 miles away, but whether it arrived through direct exchange, intermarriage, raiding, or as a keepsake from a journey, we cannot say. Each artifact is both evidence of connection and a black box of logistics. Cultural significance adds another layer. To us, neobrarite is a geological curiosity. To prehistoric peoples, it might have carried symbolic weight beyond utility. Stone isn't just stone in many traditions. It is part of cosmology, a gift from the land imbued with power. The chalk itself, layered with the bones of ancient sea monsters, may have been more than raw material. It may have been myth made tangible. Imagine quarrying stone from cliffs where mosasaur skeletons jutted from the walls. Would that not shape the way you thought about the tools made from it? Archaeology can measure hardness and fracture patterns, but it cannot fully capture meaning. And so the question remains unresolved. How widely was Smoky Hill silicified chalk quarried and traded? The clues point in multiple directions but stop short of certainty. Perhaps the truth lies in future sourcing studies, or perhaps it will remain forever ambiguous, a material that was both local and far-reaching, common and sacred. What's certain is that plain societies didn't rely on a single stone source. Just to the east, the Flint Hills offered Florence chert, renowned for its quality and distributed even more widely. Compared to neobrarite, Florence chert was the Cadillac of tool stone. But its spread too raises questions. How exactly did it move across the plains, and what social ties carried it so far from its Kansas heartland? That is the next mystery. 24. Florence, Flint Hills, chert. What were the full trade routes and social ties behind the vast spread of these high-quality napping stones? Walk into the Flint Hills of eastern Kansas, and the landscape almost feels like it hums with stone. Beneath the tall-grass prairie lies a massive layer of Florence chert, sometimes called Florence A, of Flint Hills Flint, one of the highest quality tool stones in North America. Fine-grained, durable, and predictable when struck, it was the prehistoric equivalent of steel, a material that shaped knives, projectile points, scrapers, drills, and all the cutting edges needed to sustain daily life. The sheer abundance of Florence chert, combined with its superior quality, made it not just a local resource, but a commodity that traveled far beyond Kansas. Archaeologists have found Florence chert artifacts hundreds of miles away in Nebraska, Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, and beyond. This raises a mystery as vast as the plains themselves. How exactly did it move so widely? And what social ties carried it across such distances? The first piece of the puzzle lies in the stone itself. Florence chert wasn't just abundant, it was conspicuous. Outcrops along creek beds and ridges yielded enormous nodules, sometimes the size of boulders. Quarry sites in the Flint Hills revealed pits, broken cores, and mountains of flakes, evidence of systematic extraction. People clearly came here with purpose, stripping raw material in bulk, then transporting it for use or trade. Some sites look almost industrial, the prehistoric equivalent of open-pit mines. The scale of quarrying alone suggests that this was not a casual activity. Organized labor, planning, and perhaps even ritual likely accompanied the work of removing stone from the hills. Once quarried, Florence church didn't stay put. Its spread across the plains suggests multiple trade routes. Some artifacts likely moved hand to hand through down-the-line exchange, passed from one community to the next, like currency that slowly radiated outward. Other evidence points to more deliberate movement, groups traveling directly to the Flint Hills to quarry stone themselves, then carrying it back to their homelands. Archaeologists have found half-finished bifaces, tools in the process of being shaped, hundreds of miles from the Flint Hills, a sign that people transported not just raw nodules, but preformed blanks that could later be sharpened into finished tools. This strategy reduced weight while still preserving value, an efficient way to move stone across long distances. The real enigma, though, isn't just the logistics. It's the social fabric behind the movement. Trade is never just about goods, it's about relationships. The spread of Florence church hints at alliances, marriages, seasonal gatherings, and perhaps even pilgrimage-like journeys to the Flint Hills themselves. Plain societies were not isolated bands wandering randomly. They were plugged into a web of interactions, and stone was one of the threads that held that web together. One possibility is that Florence church functioned as both toolstone and status marker. Its distinctive quality and appearance meant it could signify connections to the Flint Hills even when carried far away. Owning a finely crafted point of Florence Flint, hundreds of miles from its source, might have been a subtle way of saying, I am part of a network. I have ties. I am not alone. Archaeology shows us distribution maps, but what those maps really reveal are lines of human connection. Yet much remains uncertain. We can trace artifacts to their geological source through geochemical analysis, but the stories of who carried them, why they were given, and how they were valued beyond utility are lost in silence. Were they traded as practical goods, exchanged as diplomatic gifts, or carried as symbols of alliance and belonging? The artifacts cannot say, and this ambiguity feeds the larger mystery. The Florence church trade wasn't just economic, it was cultural, woven into the rhythm of plains life. To map it fully would be to reconstruct not just trade routes, but entire social worlds. For now, we only see the outlines. But if Florence church traveled far, one Kansas site reminds us that other rocks fell from the sky rather than being dug from the earth. Outside the town of Haviland lies a crater formed by a Palisade meteorite, a place where cosmic stone literally slammed into the plains. The impact is real. The meteorites are famous, but the timing and exact look of that event remain unresolved. Was the strike medieval or was it far older? 25. Haviland, Brenham. Crater, exactly when did the Palisade hit? Medieval centuries versus earlier. And what did the impact look like on the plains? In western Kansas, near the quiet town of Haviland, the ground hides a scar that doesn't quite behave like the other scars of Kansas geology. This isn't a sinkhole from dissolving gypsum or a basin formed by collapsing salt beds. This is something stranger, heavier, and more cosmic. The Brenham crater, site of a Palisade meteorite fall, The crater itself is shallow and subtle, barely recognizable to the casual eye compared to the dramatic poles of Arizona's Barringer crater or Siberia's Tunguska blast zone. But the debris scattered from it, shimmering chunks of nickel iron studded with translucent olivine crystals, reminds us that something extraordinary happened here. The mystery is not whether it happened, but when and how. Dating the Brenham impact has been a century-long headache. Early estimates swung wildly from thousands of years ago to mere centuries. Some researchers suggested a date in the medieval period, around 1,000 years ago, based on shallow burial of meteorites and the relatively preserved state of the crater. Others lean toward much older ages, arguing that soil development and weathering implied a prehistoric event lost to memory long before written history. Today, radiocarbon analysis of organic materials from soils associated with the strewn field has narrowed the timeline but not eliminated uncertainty. Was this a strike witnessed by native plains peoples, perhaps woven into oral traditions, or did it occur in a deeper past when mastodons still roamed the plains? The evidence refuses to give us one definitive answer. The palladides themselves complicate the story further. Unlike ordinary stony meteorites, palladides are rare, formed deep inside the cores of differentiated asteroids. Their mix of iron-nickel alloy and gem-like olivine crystals gives them an otherworldly appearance, metallic networks holding glassy green fragments that sparkle when cut and polished. Brenham's palladides are among the most famous in the world, with specimens displayed in museums from Washington, D.C. to London. Their beauty distracts from the fact that they arrived here through violence, falling from space with enough energy to gouge the earth and scatter fragments across miles of prairie. But what did the impact itself look like? Reconstructions suggest a fiery streak across the sky, followed by an explosion that showered fragments over a wide area. The crater, modest by cosmic standards, may have been around 50 feet across and less than 20 feet deep. Yet even a small impact of this type would have shaken the ground, startled wildlife, and left a mark visible for generations. Imagine standing on the plains, hearing a roar like thunder that doesn't end, then seeing a glowing fireball slam into the earth. Did communities nearby flee, or did they approach the smoking hole with reverence, interpreting it as a sign from the sky? That question lingers because meteorites from Brenham show signs of being collected and curated by native peoples long before modern meteorite hunters arrived. Archaeological finds suggest that fragments may have been transported and worked into tools or ceremonial objects. If true, that means local communities not only noticed the fall but valued its cosmic debris. Was the crater itself a sacred site, remembered in story and avoided in settlement? We can only speculate, because the oral traditions tied directly to the event have not survived in full. And so the mystery of the Brenham impact remains twofold. First, the scientific puzzle. Exactly when did it happen? And can modern dating finally pin it down to a century or millennium? Second, the cultural puzzle. What did it mean to the people who lived on the plains when it happened, or who later encountered its gleaming fragments in the soil? Even today, the Brenham strewn field continues to produce surprises. Meteorite hunters have unearthed masses weighing hundreds of pounds, with many more likely still buried. Mapping this distribution is its own enigma. How many large pieces remain underground, and what can the pattern of their scatter tell us about the meteor's breakup and flight path? That question is the next step in unraveling Kansas's cosmic mystery. 26. The Brenham-Strewn Field. How many large masses remain buried, and what does the distribution reveal about breakup and flight path? If the Brenham crater is the wound, the strewn field is the blood spatter. Across several square miles of Kiowa County, Kansas, metallic fragments of the Palisade meteorite lie scattered in the soil, some the size of pebbles, others weighing hundreds of pounds. Together, they form what scientists call a strewn field, the pattern of debris left when a meteor breaks apart in the atmosphere or on impact. At Brenham, this pattern is more than just a curiosity. It's one of the richest Palisade-strewn fields ever found. And it leaves us with a pair of haunting questions. How many large masses are still out there, waiting to be unearthed? And what can the scatter pattern tell us about the meteor's fiery death flight across the Kansas sky? The history of discovery here reads like a detective story stretched across centuries. The first major Brenham meteorites were recovered in the 1880s, when a farmer's plow struck something harder than limestone. Soon collectors and dealers descended, pulling out masses that dazzled with their olivine crystals. Over the decades, more and more fragments were found, on the surface, in fields, in shallow pits. By the 20th century, meteorite hunters with metal detectors began scouring the land, unearthing massive specimens. The largest so far weighed over 1,000 pounds. And yet, despite more than a century of searching, finds keep turning up. The earth, it seems, still hides treasures from the sky. The persistence of new discoveries suggests one of two things. Either the strewn field is staggeringly rich, with hundreds of large fragments still buried, or meteorite hunters have barely scratched its surface. Both possibilities feel staggering. Palisades are among the rarest meteorites on Earth, and here in Kansas lies a field littered with them. How many remain is unknown, but educated guesses suggest that dozens, perhaps hundreds, of large masses could still be hiding under the soil, shielded from detection by depth or land use. Each plowing season, each new survey has the chance to bring another to light. But the strewn field is more than a collector's dream. Its distribution is a scientific clue. By mapping where fragments fall, researchers can reconstruct the meteor's breakup and trajectory. Typically, larger masses land near the end of the fall line, while smaller pieces scatter more widely. At Brenham, the pattern is complex, with concentrations suggesting mid-air explosions as the meteor shattered. The spread of fragments hints at both aerodynamic forces and ground impact dispersal, producing a hybrid field that resists simple explanation. In essence, the distribution is the meteor's last message, encrypted in geography. Studying that message isn't easy. The field lies across private lands, with much of it worked as farmland. Agricultural activity can disturb the scatter, moving pieces out of their original positions. And the commercialization of meteorite hunting, complete with auctions, collectors, and museum trades, means data often slips through scientific fingers. Every fragment pulled from the soil carries information about its location, orientation, and depth, but unless carefully recorded, that information is lost. Brenham's strewn field is as much a story of gaps in knowledge as it is of spectacular finds. Still, the broad outline is clear enough. The Brenham meteor entered the atmosphere at high speed, fragmented violently, and scattered debris in a fan-shaped pattern across the plains. Some pieces buried themselves deep, protected from erosion and plows. Others weathered closer to the surface, waiting to be struck by shovels or metal detectors centuries later. The field is both a fossilized moment of cosmic violence and a slow-motion archaeological dig, unfolding piece by piece. And perhaps the most haunting thought is this: every buried mass is both a geological specimen and a cultural relic. To prehistoric peoples, the shining crystals may have been sacred gifts. To scientists, they are fragments of planetary cores, windows into the formation of the solar system. To farmers, they were obstacles in fields. And to collectors, they are treasures with price tags. The strewn field embodies all these meanings at once, scattered across Kansas soil. But if Brenham shows us cosmic stone raining down from the sky, another Kansas mystery returns our gaze to the earth itself. At the state's far northwest corner, the land breaks apart into labyrinthine canyons carved from loess. The Arikari breaks look like scars from giants, but the deeper puzzle is not geological alone. It's how ancient peoples used this strange hidden landscape. Were these canyons lookouts, corridors, or seasonal camps? The evidence is frustratingly thin, and the mystery lingers in silence. 27. Arikari breaks. Cheyenne, Komi. Beyond geology, how did ancient peoples use these less canyons, corridors, lookouts, seasonal camps? Stand on the high plains of northwest Kansas, and for miles the land appears relentlessly flat. Grass, sky, horizon, and then suddenly the earth collapses. The Arikari breaks tear open the monotony like a hidden world, a landscape of steep-walled canyons, ravines, and buttes carved into soft glass deposits. From above they look accidental, almost like someone dragged their fingers across a sandbox. But for anyone who ventures down into them, the breaks feel deliberate, a secret carved into the plains. The geology is straightforward. Thousands of years ago, wind piled loess into thick blankets across the region, and water slowly cut through it, leaving a maze of cliffs and gullies. The cultural history, however, is anything but straightforward. The breaks are beautiful, but beauty is rarely why humans choose a landscape. The real question is, how did ancient peoples use them? Archaeological evidence here is frustratingly scarce. Unlike the Smoky Hill Chalk or the Great Bend River valleys, the breaks haven't produced dense clusters of artifacts or settlements, but the silence itself is provocative. Did people avoid the breaks, seeing them as barriers in an otherwise open prairie? Or did they use them in ways subtle enough to leave faint traces? Hunting camps tucked into sheltered alcoves, lookouts on the high cliffs, or temporary gathering spots along seasonal water sources. One possibility is that the breaks acted as corridors. In an otherwise flat world, canyons offer cover, shade, and occasional springs. For groups moving across the plains, the gullies may have been natural highways. paths to follow, camp beside, or use for ambush and defense. Archaeologists speculate that bison hunts could have been coordinated here, driving animals into confined spaces where hunters gained the advantage. If true, the breaks were not just geological oddities but tools in survival strategies, shaping how people engage with the prairie's most important resource. Another interpretation frames the breaks as lookouts. The rims of these canyons provide commanding views of the plains, with sightlines stretching for miles. In a world without towers or satellites, high ground mattered. From these vantage points, groups could watch for migrating herds, incoming weather, or approaching rivals. A scattering of projectile points found on cliff edges suggests that people at least paused here, perhaps scouting, perhaps signaling. The evidence is thin, but the logic is strong. When the land itself offers a watchtower, humans rarely ignore it. There's also the possibility of seasonal camps. The breaks provide shelter from the prairie wind and, in wetter centuries, intermittent springs. Small bands of hunters or families could have used the canyons as temporary refuges during migrations or hunts. The absence of permanent village remains doesn't rule this out. Mobility was a core feature of many plains lifeways. If the breaks were used seasonally, their archaeological footprint would be faint, easily erased by erosion, or buried beneath landslides of loess. What we interpret as absence may simply be the work of time. And finally, we can't dismiss the symbolic dimension. Landscapes. This dramatic rarely escapes spiritual or cultural meaning. To some groups, the breaks may have been liminal places, thresholds between the ordinary plains and something otherworldly. Oral traditions from surrounding regions often tie unusual geological features to creation stories, sacred beings, or historic encounters. Even without direct records, it's not hard to imagine the breaks carrying similar weight. So what we're left with is a paradox. The Arikari breaks are one of Kansas's most dramatic natural features, yet their human history is elusive, faint, and speculative. They remind us that not all mysteries are written in artifacts. Some are written in absences, in landscapes that should have hosted gatherings but instead echo with silence, and this silence carries us to an even bigger riddle. Just east of the breaks, the Central Plains tradition villages once flourished, farming communities with earth lodges and fields. By the 14th and 15th centuries, however, they began to fade. Was it drought, warfare, disease, migration? The reasons remain debated, and the disappearance of these villages deepens the sense of fragility woven into the plains. 28. Why did Central Plains tradition villages fade around the 14th, 15th centuries? Drought, conflict, disease, migrations. The Central Plains tradition, CPT villages, were once among the most impressive prehistoric settlements in the Midwest. From roughly AD 1000 to 1400, farming communities spread across Kansas, Nebraska, and Missouri, building earth lodges, cultivating maize, beans, and squash, and establishing networks that connected them to societies far beyond the plains. Archaeologists digging into these sites find the remains of well-planned households, circular lodges with storage pits, clay-lined hearths, and the debris of daily life. These weren't small camps, they were organized villages, permanent enough to leave an unmistakable archaeological footprint. And then, by the 15th century, many of them were gone. The puzzle of their fading is one of the great mysteries of Kansas prehistory. One explanation lies in climate. The 14th and early 15th centuries fell within the late medieval warm period transitioning into the Little Ice Age, a time when weather turned erratic across the northern hemisphere. On the plains, drought cycles intensified. Tree-ring studies and sediment records show prolonged dry spells that would have devastated maize agriculture. Without stable rainfall, crop yields plummeted, and farming villages, so dependent on stored surpluses, were left vulnerable. Drought didn't just mean less food, it meant the unraveling of social stability. Scarcity breeds tension, and in tightly packed villages, hunger could turn neighbors into rivals. Conflict may have compounded the problem. Evidence of fortified sites, burned lodges, and skeletal trauma suggests that warfare increased during this period. Whether raids came from rival CPT villages, incoming Athabascan-speaking groups, early Apachean peoples, or pressures from Mississippian neighbors to the east, the archaeological signs point toward violence. The CPT people were not isolated. They lived at the crossroads of shifting populations. Competition for dwindling resources may have escalated into conflicts that made village life untenable. Disease, too, hovers as a possible factor, though it is harder to prove. Epidemics are often associated with European contact, which accelerated in the 16th century. But pathogens can travel far ahead of direct encounters through trade and migration networks. It is possible that waves of illness weakened populations even before Europeans reached the plains in person. While direct skeletal evidence is sparse, the timing overlaps suspiciously with the broader demographic declines seen across North America. Then there is migration. Archaeological sequences suggest that as CPT villages faded, populations shifted south and east, merging into new cultural identities. Some scholars connect these movements with the rise of the Wichita and related Caddoan-speaking peoples, whose grass house towns appear in later centuries along rivers in Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. If so, the CPT didn't collapse. They transformed, abandoning earth lodges for grass houses, reorganizing their economies, and adapting to new environments. What looks like disappearance may actually be reinvention. Of course, the most likely explanation isn't one factor, but all of them together. Drought stressed agriculture. Stress fueled conflict. Conflict drove migration. Migration spread disease. And the cycle reinforced itself until the once thriving CPT villages dwindled, leaving behind only the earth ring outlines of lodges and the ash of abandoned hearths. The fading of the Central Plains tradition is a reminder of how fragile permanence is on the plains. What looks like stability, villages, fields, houses, can vanish within a century, leaving the land to grass once again. Archaeologists walk across Kansas fields today, spotting circular depressions and scattered pottery, and know that entire communities once thrived there. But they also know those communities unraveled for reasons we still can't fully untangle. And just as the CPT story ends in mystery, another begins nearby. Along the Missouri River and into eastern Kansas, Hopewellian artifacts have surfaced far from their Ohio heartland, pipes, ornaments, and burial mounds. How far did this influence really stretch into Kansas, and how did it blend with local traditions? That lingering question marks the next enigma. 29. The western reach of the Kansas City Hopewell. How far into Kansas did Hopewellian influence extend, and how did it blend with local traditions? In the forests of Ohio and Illinois, the Hopewell culture built earthworks of astonishing complexity. Geometric mounds that aligned with the cosmos, burial centers filled with finely crafted artifacts, and trade networks that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. Their influence radiated outward in every direction during the Middle Woodland period, roughly 100 BC to AD 500, and one of the stranger questions in Kansas archaeology is how far west this influence really reached. The so-called Kansas City Hopewell has left tantalizing traces, mounds, pottery, and exotic goods along the Missouri and Kansas rivers. But just how deep into Kansas did Hopewellian presence extend, and was it direct colonization, cultural borrowing, or something more ambiguous? Archaeologists have identified Hopewell-style artifacts in eastern Kansas that mirror the broader Hopewell world. Pottery with distinctive decorations, platform pipes carved with animal effigies, obsidian blades sourced to the Rocky Mountains, and copper ornaments hammered from Great Lakes deposits have all surfaced in burial contexts. These finds point to participation in the Hopewell exchange system, a vast network where materials, ideas, and ceremonial practices moved across thousands of miles. But what exactly does participation mean? Did Hopewell groups migrate west and establish communities in Kansas, or did local populations adopt certain practices and artifacts without wholesale cultural transformation? One school of thought argues for limited colonization. The construction of burial mounds in the Kansas City region, complete with exotic grave goods, suggests direct Hopewell presence rather than distant imitation. These were not generic burial practices. They carried the hallmarks of the Hopewell ceremonial complex. If true, then eastern Kansas wasn't just a peripheral contact zone, but an active frontier where Hopewell peoples lived, worshipped, and interacted with locals. Another interpretation is more cautious. It suggests that local woodland people selectively adopted Hopewell traits while retaining their own traditions. In this view, Kansas Hopewell is less a colony and more a hybrid. Indigenous groups integrated Hopewell styles of pottery and burial into existing lifeways, signaling affiliation with the wider Hopewell world without fully abandoning their identity. Cultural blending, not cultural replacement. Archaeological layers sometimes show exactly this. Mounds with Hopewell artifacts alongside local ceramics, a juxtaposition that hints at negotiation rather than domination. The uncertainty deepens when we move westward. Beyond the Missouri and lower Kansas rivers, Hopewell artifacts become scarcer. Did influence peter out into absence, Or are we simply missing evidence because sites remain undiscovered, eroded, or destroyed by centuries of farming? It's possible that Hopewell connections extended much farther but left only faint traces, a lost chain of contacts now buried beneath prairie sod. The moral weight of the question is worth pausing on. Hopewell wasn't just about artifacts, it was about meaning. The elaborate burial rituals, the careful placement of goods, the construction of earthworks all reflected a cosmology in which death, community, and the cosmos were inseparable. If that worldview stretched into Kansas, then the land itself carried a sacred geography layered onto rivers and ridges. If it didn't, then eastern Kansas stood as a liminal edge, a borderland where influence faded into something different. Either way, the uncertainty speaks to how porous cultural boundaries were on the plains. Ideas traveled even when people didn't. What we're left with is a ghostly outline of influence, visible in artifacts but hazy in intention. Kansas was connected to Hopewell, but how deeply, how permanently, and how deliberately remain unsettled. And this unsettledness pushes us forward in time into the proto-historic period when new groups carried their traditions into Kansas. At Scott County's El Cuartelejo site, Taos and Picuris refugees built a small pueblo alongside Plains Apache, complete with irrigation ditches. But who engineered this unlikely experiment, and why was it ultimately abandoned? That is the next mystery the land holds. 30. El Cuartelejo, Scottco, Taos, Picuris, refugees and plains. Apache shared a small pueblo. Who engineered the irrigation, and why was it abandoned? On the high plains of western Kansas, where short grass stretches to the horizon and water is a constant struggle, lies one of the strangest archaeological sites in the state, El Cuartelejo. The name given by the Spanish translates loosely to the far quarter, a fitting description for what it was. A small, adobe-style pueblo hundreds of miles removed from the heart of the Puebloan world in New Mexico. Its existence seems improbable. A pueblo in Kansas, built not by local plains villagers, but by refugees from Taos and Picuris who fled northward in the 1600s, seeking safety among the Plains Apache. The site has been excavated, mapped, and partially reconstructed, but its mysteries persist. Chief among them, who engineered the irrigation that made this settlement possible, and why did such a remarkable cultural experiment end in abandonment? El Cuartelejo was no sprawling metropolis like its Sanoa, but it was far more permanent than a hunting camp. Archaeologists uncovered rectangular rooms built of adobe, storage pits, hearths, and, most intriguingly, a system of irrigation ditches designed to divert water from nearby springs to agricultural plots. The presence of irrigation in western Kansas is striking. This was not the casual gardening of a transient camp, but the deliberate investment of a community determined to grow crops in a marginal environment. Corn, beans, and squash could thrive here if watered, and the irrigation system suggests forethought and engineering skill. But who actually designed and dug those ditches? Some argue it must have been the Puebloan refugees themselves, bringing with them the irrigation traditions of the Rio Grande Valley. Taos and Picuris peoples had centuries of experience diverting water in arid landscapes, and transplanting that knowledge to Kansas would have been second nature. Others counter that the Plains Apache may have played a stronger role. While less associated with irrigation, the Apache had deep knowledge of the high plains environment. A collaborative effort seems most likely. Pueblo refugees supplied the architectural and agricultural expertise, while Apache allies provided the local know-how and protection necessary to establish a foothold. The abandonment of El Cuartelejo is even harder to pin down. Spanish records note its existence by the late 1600s and mention attempts to relocate the Pueblo refugees back to New Mexico in subsequent decades. Archaeological evidence suggests that the site did not last long beyond these events. Why? Perhaps Spanish pressure was decisive. Colonial authorities were never thrilled about rebellious Pueblo communities escaping their reach. Or perhaps environmental stress took its toll. Irrigation requires constant upkeep, and in a challenging climate, drought or resource strain could have undermined the settlement. Another possibility is political. The plains were a chessboard of shifting alliances. Apache against Comanche, Wichita against Pawnee, Spanish against French. A small pueblo might have been swept up in conflicts larger than itself. What is certain is that El Cuartelejo represents more than just a curiosity. It is a rare example of cultural blending on the plains, where two very different traditions, Puebloan farmers and Apache nomads, shared a space and created something unique. It speaks to resilience, adaptation, and the will to carve permanence out of uncertainty. Yet its abandonment underscores the fragility of such experiments. The adobe walls crumbled, the ditches filled with silt, and the pueblo slipped into obscurity until archaeologists brought it back to light centuries later. Today, a reconstructed outline of El Cuartelejo stands in Lake Scott State Park, a reminder that even in the most unlikely places, people experimented with new ways of living. And it leads directly into another puzzle about the Apachean presence in Kansas. The Dismal River culture, widely linked to early Apache groups. Their pottery, camps, and trails dot the western plains. But what exact paths and timelines did these Athabascan-speaking peoples follow into and through Kansas? That remains an open question. 31. The Dismal River, Apachean story in western Kansas. What exact paths and timelines did Athabascan-speaking groups follow into and through the region? When archaeologists talk about the Dismal River aspect, the name alone sounds like a warning label. In reality, it refers to a distinctive archaeological culture identified in Nebraska and Kansas, most often linked with early Plains Apache groups of the 17th century. They left behind small settlements marked by shallow house depressions, ash pits, and a distinctive kind of pottery, thick, grit-tempered vessels with simple designs. Scattered across western Kansas, these sites form a breadcrumb trail of movement. Yet despite decades of study, the questions remain unresolved. When exactly did these Athabascan-speaking Apachean peoples arrive? Which routes did they take? And how long did they remain before moving south toward New Mexico and Texas? The origins of Athabascan speakers are traced much farther north, in what is now Alaska and western Canada. At some point in prehistory, bands of these mobile hunters and gatherers began migrating southward along the Rockies and Plains. Linguists estimate that Apachean groups could have reached the Central Plains by the 1400s or 1500s, but the archaeological record places them more clearly in the 1600s. That timing is significant. It means they were entering Kansas just as Spanish expeditions were probing north from Mexico, and just as disease and upheaval were destabilizing long-standing societies across the plains. The Apache didn't arrive in a vacuum. They arrived in a storm. The dismal riversides in Kansas reflect this transitional moment. The settlements were not large villages like those of the Wichita or earlier Central Plains tradition. Instead, they were modest, clusters of a few houses, storage pits, and refuse areas. Their size suggests mobile bands who stayed for a season or two before moving on. Yet even in their impermanence, they reveal complexity. The pottery, though plain, is distinctive enough to mark cultural identity. The presence of European trade goods, metal tools, beads, occasionally fragments of iron, shows that these groups were quickly drawn into the expanding colonial economy. They were newcomers, but they weren't isolated. The puzzle is how they move. Did Apachean groups enter Kansas from the north, trickling down through Nebraska along river valleys like the Republican and Solomon? Or did they push eastward from the Rockies, cutting across the high plains in waves? Some evidence suggests multiple entry points, with different bands taking different routes. If so, the Dismal River label may cover a mosaic of movements rather than a single migration. This ambiguity is compounded by the fact that Athabascan speakers were highly mobile. Their archaeological footprint is faint by design. Lightweight houses, temporary camps, and minimal material baggage mean they could vanish from the landscape almost as quickly as they appeared. As for the timeline, scholars debate how long they lingered in Kansas. Some argue their stay was brief, perhaps only a few generations in the 1600s, before pressure from Comanche groups pushed them southward into New Mexico, where they became entangled in Spanish colonial politics. Others suggest a longer presence, with Apachean bands circulating through western Kansas for centuries, adapting to the shifting dynamics of trade and conflict. Without radiocarbon dates tied directly to Dismal River features, the chronology remains fuzzy. What is clear is that the Apachean arrival marked a turning point in Plains history. Their mobility, hunting skills, and a strategic use of river valleys set them apart from more sedentary farming groups. They were also among the first Plains peoples to integrate horses into their culture once Spanish animals spread north. That transformation, however, belongs to a slightly later chapter. In Kansas, we catch them on the cusp, still semi-sedentary, still experimenting with farming and pottery, not yet the fully mobile horse-mounted Apache recorded in the 18th century. The Dismal River story is at its core, a mystery of paths. Lines drawn across the plains by people moving fast, staying light, and leaving behind just enough evidence for us to argue about. We know they came. We know they left. The details in between are shadows. And speaking of shadows, the record of Kansas petroglyphs casts its own confusing pattern. Why are so many of them clustered in just a handful of counties? Comanche, Ellsworth, Greenwood, Kiowa, Lincoln, Montgomery, Ottawa, Rice, Russell. Are we seeing genuine cultural patterning or just the biases of where archaeologists have chosen to look? That's the next riddle. 32. Why are Kansas petroglyphs so clustered? Comanche, Ellsworth, Greenwood, Kiowa, Lincoln, Montgomery, Ottawa, Rice, Russell. Are we seeing cultural patterning or survey bias? If you plug Kansas petroglyphs on a map, the pattern jumps out. Tight clusters in certain counties, yawning gaps elsewhere. The sandstone carvings show up in Comanche County, in the Smoky Hills counties of Ellsworth, Rice, and Russell, in a smattering of central and southeastern counties like Montgomery, Greenwood, Ottawa, Kiowa, and Lincoln. Beyond these spots, the map goes quiet. It's almost as if ancient artists decided to limit themselves to certain pockets of the landscape while ignoring vast stretches of prairie. But is that really the case? Did prehistoric Kansans carve intentionally in these clusters? Or are we just seeing the accidents of preservation and modern discovery? The geological explanation comes first. Petroglyphs require a canvas, and Kansas doesn't provide that canvas everywhere. Much of the state is dominated by soils, limestones, or shales too hard, too soft, or too crumbly to hold engravings. But in places like the Smoky Hills, Dakota sandstone outcrops in cliffs and boulders with just the right combination of softness for carving and durability for preservation. Comanche County's caves and overhangs offer another natural canvas, while southeastern counties expose sandstones and limestones that could be pegged into shapes. From this perspective, clustering may reflect geology more than culture. Artists carved where stone allowed. Elsewhere, there simply wasn't a surface to work with. Still, geology isn't the whole answer. Even within sandstone-rich areas, carvings appear in concentrated panels rather than evenly scattered. That suggests cultural choices at play. Certain cliffs, canyons, or valleys may have been selected for symbolic reasons. Proximity to water, alignment with the sun, visibility along travel routes, or significance in oral traditions. The clustering could represent sacred landscapes, ritual centers where communities gathered and left their marks. If true, the carvings aren't randomly distributed at all. They're part of intentional cultural patterning, with meaning tied to place. The third explanation is more mundane but no less likely. Survey bias. Archaeologists and enthusiasts have not combed every inch of Kansas with equal intensity. Petroglyphs are often discovered when ranchers, hikers, or road crews stumble across them. Regions with active local historians or more accessible outcrops get more attention. Remote or privately owned lands may hide panels that no one has documented. In this view, the clusters on the map may simply be where we've bothered to look. Vast stretches of Kansas could still hold carvings buried under soil, obscured by vegetation, or eroded into near invisibility. And then there's the possibility of loss. Sandstone weathers quickly. Petroglyphs exposed to wind, rain, and freeze-thaw cycles can fade within centuries, dissolving until only faint scars remain. Others have been obliterated by quarrying, construction, or vandalism. Entire sites may have existed in counties that now appear empty on the map, their carvings erased before anyone recorded them. What we see as gaps may actually be ghosts. The frustrating part is that all these explanations could be true at once. Geology constrained the possibilities, culture selected certain places, survey bias skewed the sample, and erosion erased the rest. The clustering on the map might reflect real cultural hubs, or it might be an artifact of incomplete evidence. Either way, the result is the same, an uneven record that raises more questions than it answers. And those questions matter. If clusters represent intentional sacred landscapes, then each one could have functioned like a ceremonial district, comparable in importance to mound complexes elsewhere. If instead the pattern is mostly a product of geology and survey bias, then Kansas's petroglyph record may be far richer and more widespread than we currently realize. Both scenarios reshape how we think about prehistoric life on the plains. But the land refuses to give us easy resolutions. Even in areas where the clusters are undeniable, like Comanche or Rice counties, dating and interpretation remain slippery. We know the marks are there. We just don't know who carved them, when or why they chose those particular cliffs. And the mystery of clustering leads naturally into another geological puzzle, just a short step away. In the little basin, the ground itself is pocked with small depressions, sinkholes within sinkholes, scars within scars. Could these features reveal the hidden history of groundwater collapse across the Holocene? If so, what timeline do they trace and why is the record still incomplete? 33. Little basin's pockmarked floor hints at older sinkholes. Can we date the sequence to reconstruct Holocene groundwater collapse history? South of Big Basin in Clark County lies its smaller sibling, aptly called Little Basin. On the surface, the name suggests a simple depression, another sinkhole in a region where salt and gypsum collapse structures are common. But step inside the basin, and the ground itself complicates the story. The floor of Little Basin is not smooth. It is dimpled, irregular, pockmarked with dozens of smaller depressions. Miniature sinkholes nested inside a larger one. They give the landscape a strange, cratered appearance, like the surface of the moon translated onto Kansas prairie. These scars hint at an ongoing process, a landscape in motion, where collapse is not a singular event but a sequence. The mystery is whether we can date this sequence precisely enough to reconstruct a history of Holocene groundwater collapse in the region. Geologically, the explanation is straightforward. Beneath Clark County lies a thick sequence of Permian rocks rich in salt and gypsum, minerals that dissolve readily when groundwater seeps through them. Over centuries, water carves out voids, and eventually, the overlying sediments and salts collapse. The result: sinkholes, some small and shallow, others massive like Big Basin. Little Basin is one of these collapse features, but unlike its sibling, it records multiple events layered over time. The smaller sinkholes within it suggest repeated episodes of dissolution and collapse, not just one dramatic failure. In other words, Little Basin is not a single scar, but a palimpsest of scars, a history written into the ground. The challenge is reading that history. Sinkholes don't leave neat stratigraphic records like river terraces or lake sediments. They collapse, refill, and collapse again, erasing their own timelines in the process. Dating them requires creative approaches. Radiocarbon dating of organic material trapped in sediments at the bottom of depressions. Optically stimulated luminescence dating of infilled soils, or mapping of collapse sequences with ground-penetrating radar. Some efforts have been made, but the results so far remain frustratingly incomplete. We know sinkholes have been forming here throughout the Holocene, roughly the last 10,000 years, but we lack a precise chronology. Why does that chronology matter? Because sinkholes are not just geological curiosities. They are windows into hydrological history. If we could date each collapse in Little Basin, we could reconstruct fluctuations in groundwater levels, rainfall patterns, and regional climate shifts across millennia. Each depression might correspond to a pulse of weather conditions that dissolved more gypsum, or to drought cycles that lowered water tables and destabilized the ground. In effect, Little Basin could serve as a natural archive of Holocene climate dynamics on the high plains. There's also the cultural angle. Sinkholes like St. Jacob's Well and Big Basin played important roles in native traditions, often seen as sacred or mysterious. Did Little Basin carry similar weight? Its pockmarked floor with hole nested inside hole almost begs for symbolic interpretation, a place where the earth seemed alive, constantly opening and reshaping itself. Archaeological evidence is scarce, but it's not hard to imagine that people noticed this landscape and wove it into their cosmology. A place where the ground refused stability would not have gone unremarked. The irony is that modern science faces the same difficulty as ancient observers. The land resists clarity. The collapses are real, the evidence tangible, but the timeline is slippery. Without precise dating, we are left with educated guesses, snapshots of processes we can describe, but not fully sequence. The basin remains a riddle, half answered by geology, half swallowed by time. And with that, we reach the end of our catalogue of Kansas pre-flood mysteries. From the sprawling city of Etzanoa to the fragile glyphs of sandstone cliffs, from cosmic stones that fell from the sky to springs that refused to run dry. The land has confronted us with more questions than answers. Yet that may be the point. Kansas, far from being a flat, forgettable flyover, is a landscape thick with enigmas, its soil and stone saturated with mysteries science still cannot fully explain. The stories don't resolve. They circle, collapse, reappear, much like the sinkholes of Little Basin itself. And maybe that's the quiet revelation. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to remind us that the ground beneath our feet is never as stable as we pretend, and that the past always keeps a few secrets tucked just out of reach.